The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. It was the evening on which Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the managers of the Paris Opera, were giving a last gala performance to mark their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing-room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen brats of the corps de ballet. They rushed in amid great confusion, some giving vent to forced and unnatural laughter, others to cries of terror. Sorelli, who wished to be alone for a moment, looked around angrily at the mad and tumultuous crowd. It was little Jeanne, the girl with the tip-tilted nose and the forget-me-not eyes, who gave the explanation in a trembling voice, "It's the ghost." Then she locked the door. Sorelli was very superstitious. She shuddered when she heard little Jeanne speak of the ghost, called her a silly little fool, and then, as she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and the opera ghost in particular, at once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," said little Jeanne, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped with a moan into a chair. The room rang with a chorus of ballet girls, all talking together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes, who had suddenly stood before them in the passage without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have come straight through the wall. All the girls pretended to have met this supernatural being more or less often, and the ghost legend soon swelled to enormous proportions. They do meet so many men in dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts, but this dress suit had a peculiarity of its own. It covered a skeleton. And, of course, it had a death's head. They reminded themselves of Joseph Buquet, the chief scene-shifter at the opera, who had really seen the ghost and had said, "He is extraordinary thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeletal frame. His eyes are so deep you just see two big black holes, and his skin is a nasty yellow colour and is stretched across his bones like a drumhead. But it's the absence of his nose that is the horrible thing to look at, and the only hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks on his forehead and behind his ears." Now, Monsieur Buquet was a serious, sober, steady man, very slow at imagining things. His words had been received with interest and amazement by his fellow opera workers, and the story had spread fast. An agonizing silence now reigned in Sorelli's dressing-room. At last, little Jeanne, flinging herself upon the farthest corner of the wall, with every mark of real terror on her face, whispered, "Listen!" Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. It was like light silk sliding over the panel. Then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than the others, and went up to the door, and in a quavering voice asked, "Who's there?" Nobody answered. Then Sorelli, armed with a dagger that never left her, turned the key, drew back the door, and looked into the passage bravely. It was empty. The dancer slammed the door, and with a deep sigh said, "No, there is no one there." "Still, we saw him," Jeanne declared. "He must be somewhere prowling about. We'd better all go down to the foyer together. I shan't go alone." The child reverently touched the little coral finger ring which she wore as a charm against bad luck, while Sorelli, stealthily, with the tip of her pink right thumbnail, made a St. Andrew's cross on the wooden ring which adorned the 4th finger of her left hand. "Come, children, pull yourselves together," said Sorelli. "I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." "Yes, we saw him," cried the girls. "He had his death's head and dress coat, just as when he appeared to Joseph Buquet." A silence followed. It was broken by the little dried plum of Meg Giry, who said, "Joseph Buquet would do better to hold his tongue. My mother says the ghost doesn't like being talked about." "Why does your mother say so?" they all asked at once. Because... Nothing. I swore not to tell." This reticence exasperated the curiosity of the young ladies, who crowded round little Giry, begging her to explain herself and promising to keep the secret, until Meg, burning to say all she knew, began, "Well, it's because of the private box. Box 5 on the grand tier. Mother has charge of it. No one has had it for over a month except the ghost, and orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold. Mother has never seen him, but she has heard him. She knows because she gives him his programme." Sorelli interfered. "Giry, child, you're getting at us." Thereupon little Giry began to cry. "I ought to have held my tongue, if Mother ever came to know. But I was quite right. Joseph Bouquet had no business to talk of things that didn't concern him. It'll bring him bad luck." There was a sound of hurried and heavy footsteps in the passage, and a respectable lady, built on the lines of a Pomeranian grenadier, burst into the dressing-room and dropped groaning into a vacant armchair. Her eyes rolled madly in her brick-dust-coloured face, and she emptied a glass of liqueur that happened to be standing on a table. "How awful!" she said. "How awful! Joseph Bouquet is dead. He was found hanging in the third-floor cellar." "It's the ghost!" little Giry blurted. But she at once corrected herself with her hands pressed to her mouth. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that." All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, "Yes, it must be the ghost." No one ever knew how Joseph Bouquet met his death. The verdict at the inquest was natural suicide. A short time later, Sorelli ran into the Comte de Chagny on the first landing as he was coming up the stairs. "I was just going to you," he said. "Oh, Sorelli, what an evening! And Christine Daae, what a triumph!" The Comte de Chagny was right. No gala performance ever equaled this one. All the great composers of the day had conducted their own works in turns, but the real triumph was reserved for Christine Daae. Those who heard her say that her voice was seraphic, but this was nothing to the superhuman notes that she gave forth in the prison scene and in the final trio in Faust as Margarita. She had sung in place of the diva, La Carlotta, who was ill. No one had ever heard or seen anything like it. The whole house went mad, rising to its feet, shouting, cheering, clapping, while Christine sobbed and fainted in the arms of her fellow singers and had to be carried to her dressing-room. A few subscribers protested. Why had so great a treasure been kept from them all that time? Did they know of her hidden genius? Why had she kept it hidden? The whole thing was a mystery. The Comte de Chagny, standing up in his box, listened to all this frenzy and took part in it by applauding loudly. Philippe Georges Marie, Comte de Chagny, was just 41 years of age. He was a great aristocrat and a good-looking man. He was exquisitely polite to the women and a little haughty to the men, who did not always forgive him for his successes in society. He had an excellent heart and an irreproachable conscience. Philippe busied himself actively with his younger brother, Raoul, who was 20 years younger. In fact, he spoiled him terribly. He took him with him wherever he went. That evening he had taken him to the foyer of the ballet. Raoul had a shyness and innocence that was remarkable. He had retained, from his purely feminine education, manners that were almost candid and stamped with a charm that nothing had yet been able to sully. He also had beautiful blue eyes and a small, fair moustache. After the staggering performance and their applause for Christine Daae, Philippe turned to Raoul and saw that he was quite pale. "Don't you see," said Raoul, "that the woman's fainting?" "You look like fainting yourself," said the Count. "What's the matter?" But Raoul had recovered himself and was standing up. "Let's go and see," he said. "She never sang like that before." They were soon at the door leading from the house to the stage, Raoul leading the way, feeling that his heart no longer belonged to him, his face set with passion. They entered into the semi-darkness of a corridor ringing with the name of Daae, Daae. The Count was surprised to find that Raoul knew the way. He had never taken him to Christine's himself. He followed his brother down the passage that led to Daae's dressing-room and saw that it had never been so crammed as on that evening. The girl had not yet recovered from her fainting fit, and the doctor of the theatre had just arrived at the moment Raoul entered at his heels. Christine, therefore, received the first aid of the one, while opening her eyes in the arms of the other. "Don't you think, Doctor, that those gentlemen had better clear the room?" asked Raoul coolly. "There's no breathing here." You're quite right," said the doctor, who sent everyone away except Raoul. He imagined that the young man was only acting as he did because he had the right to. Meanwhile, Christine uttered a deep sigh, turned her head, saw Raoul, and started. "Monsieur," she said in a voice not much above a whisper, "who are you?" "Mademoiselle," he replied, pressing a fervent kiss on the diva's hand. "I am the little boy who went into the sea to rescue your scarf." Christine looked at the doctor and began to laugh. "Mademoiselle," Raoul said, "I should like to say something to you in private, something very important. When I am better, do you mind?" She rose and passed her hand over her eyelids. I should like to be alone. Please go away, all of you. Leave me. I feel very restless this evening." Raoul was soon left alone outside her room. He felt a terrible pain at his heart. Suddenly the dressing-room door opened, and the maid came out. He asked how her mistress was. She said that she was quite well, but that she wished to be left alone. One idea filled Raoul's burning brain. Of course! Christine wished to be left alone for him. Hardly breathing, he went up to the dressing-room and prepared to knock, but his hand dropped. He heard a man's voice saying, "Christine, you must love me." Christine's voice, infinitely sad and trembling, replied, "How can you talk like that when I sing only for you?" Raoul's heart, which had seemed gone forever, returned to his breast and was throbbing loudly. He held it in his two hands to make it stop. The man's voice spoke again. "Are you very tired?" "Oh, tonight I gave you my soul, and I am dead," replied Christine. Raoul heard nothing after that. He had learned what love meant, and at the same time hatred. The door suddenly opened, and Christine appeared alone. She closed the door behind her, but did not lock it. Raoul knew that he loved. He also wanted to know whom he hated, and when the passage was clear, he opened the door of the dressing-room. He went in and shut the door behind him. "There is someone here," said Raoul in a quivering voice. "What are you hiding for?" All was darkness and silence. Raoul heard only the sound of his own breathing. He quite failed to see that the indiscretion of his conduct was exceeding all bounds. He struck a match. There was no one in the room. "Am I going mad?" he thought aloud. He stood for 10 minutes in the silence of the empty room, but lover though he was, he did not even think of stealing a ribbon that would have given him the perfume of the woman he loved. During this time, the farewell ceremony, on the occasion of the retirement of Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the opera's managers, was taking place in the foyer of the ballet. Everybody remarked that the retiring managers looked cheerful, as is the Paris way. None will ever be a true Parisian who has not learned to wear a mask of gaiety over his sorrows and one of sadness, boredom, or indifference over his inward joy. Sorelli, the prima ballerina, had begun to recite her farewell speech when an exclamation from that little madcap of a Jeanne broke the moment. "The opera ghost!" she yelled, and her finger pointed to a face so pallid, so ugly, with 2 deep black cavities under the straddling eyebrows. But in the ensuing confusion, he had already slipped through the crowd. Sorelli was furious. She had not been able to finish her speech. The managers had kissed her, thanked her, and had gone to the great lobby outside where a supper was being served in their honor. Here they found the new managers, Monsieur Armand Moncharmin and Monsieur Firmin Richard. The retiring managers handed over to their successors the 2 tiny master keys which opened all the doors, thousands of doors, of the opera house. Their attention was diverted, however, by the discovery at the end of the table of that strange, wan, and fantastic face with the hollow eyes that had moments before appeared in the foyer. The friends of the retiring managers all thought this lean and skinny guest was an acquaintance of their successors, while the new manager's friends believed the cadaverous individual belonged to the old manager's party. The result was that no request was made for an explanation, no unpleasant remarks, and no jokes in bad taste were made which might have offended this visitor from the tomb. Suddenly he began to speak. "The death of that poor Bouquet is perhaps not so natural as people think. He was found this evening, hanging in the 3rd cellar." The ex-managers at once rose and stared strangely at the speaker. They looked at each other and turned whiter than the tablecloth. They made a sign to Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin and muttered a few words of excuse to the guests, and all four went into the manager's office. First, Monsieur Poligny and Monsieur Debienne asked them if they knew that man sitting at the end of the table. When they answered in the negative, the retiring managers advised them to have new locks made with the greatest of secrecy for all the rooms and closets. Messieurs Richard and Moncharmin thought this so funny that they began to laugh and to ask if there were thieves at the opera. Monsieur Poligny replied that there was something worse. There was the ghost. He went on to tell them that he would never have spoken to them of the ghost if he had not received formal orders from the ghost himself to ask them to be pleasant to him and to grant any request he might make. The announcement of the death of Joseph Bouquet had served them as a brutal reminder that whenever they had disregarded the ghost's wishes, some fantastic or disastrous event had brought them to a sense of their dependence. Monsieur Richard, however, had acquired a great reputation for practical joking, and he seemed to relish the dish which was being served up to him in his turn. He and Monsieur Moncharmin could not, at the finish, help bursting out laughing at the faces of Monsieur Poligny and Debienne, who, seeing them pass straight from a serious and supposedly sincere state of mind to one of insolent merriment, acted as though they thought the new managers had already gone mad. Monsieur Poligny went to his desk and returned with a memorandum book. It contained a paragraph at the end written in red ink in a queer, laboured handwriting. It said, "The manager shall make to the opera ghost an allowance of 20,000 francs a month, say 240,000 francs a year." "Oh, is this all? Does he not want anything else?" asked Monsieur Richard with great coolness. "Yes, he does," replied Monsieur Poligny, and read, "Box 5 on the grand tier shall be placed at the disposal of the opera ghost for every performance." Monsieur Poligny proceeded, without moving a muscle in his face. "Certainly consider what the loss over Box 5 meant to us. We really can't work to keep ghosts. That is why we prefer to go away." Thereupon the ex-managers left the office, and Messieurs Richard and Moncharmin had a great laugh. The first few days which the new partners spent at the opera were given over to the delight of finding themselves at the head of so magnificent an enterprise. They had forgotten all about that curious, fantastic story of the ghost, when an incident occurred that proved to them that the joke, if joke it were, was not over. Monsieur Richard received a letter marked private. He at once recognized the red ink and the clumsy, childish hand. He opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Manager, I am sorry to trouble you at a time when you must be so very busy, renewing important engagements, signing fresh ones, and generally displaying your excellent taste. I should like to take advantage of the fact that you have not yet turned Christine Daae out of doors by hearing her this evening in the part of Cybele, and I will ask you not to dispose of my box today, nor on the following days. I thought that your predecessors, who were always charming to me, had neglected before leaving to mention my little fads to you. I have now received a reply from those gentlemen proving that you know all about my memorandum book, and consequently that you are treating me with outrageous contempt. If you wish to live in peace, you must not begin by taking away my private box. Your most humble and obedient servant, Opera Ghost." "They're keeping up the joke," said Monsieur Richard, "but I don't call it funny." "What does it all mean?" asked Monsieur Moncharmin. "Do they imagine that because they have been managers of the opera we are going to let them have a box for an indefinite period? What is it they really want? A box for tonight? They might have been civil for all that. By the way, they seem to be greatly interested in that little Christine Daae." The whole rest of the day was spent in discussing, negotiating, signing, or cancelling contracts. The next morning, the managers received a card of thanks from the ghost. It read, "Dear Mr. Manager, thanks. Charming evening. Daae exquisite. Choruses want waking up. Will write soon for the 240,000 francs. Kind regards, O.G." On the other hand, there was a letter from Messieurs Poligny and Debienne. Gentlemen, we are much obliged for your kind thought of us. However, we have no right to occupy Box 5 on the Grand Tier, which is the exclusive property of him of whom we spoke to you when we went through the memorandum book with you the last time. See Clause 98, final paragraph. Oh, those fellows are beginning to annoy me, shouted Monsieur Richard, snatching up the letter. That evening, Box 5 was sold. The next morning, Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin, on reaching their office, found an inspector's report relating to an incident that had happened the night before in Box 5. Apparently, the occupants created a regular scandal by their laughter and their ridiculous observations. The people did not seem to be in their right mind, and they made stupid remarks, laughing and saying that they would not leave unless they had their money back. The inspector finally had them turned out indefinitely. "Send for the inspector," Monsieur Richard said to his secretary, who called for him at once. "Tell us what happened," said Monsieur Richard bluntly. "What were those people laughing at?" The inspector replied, "They must have been dining, sir, and seemed more inclined to lark about than to listen to good music. The moment they entered the box, they came out again and called the box-keeper, who asked them what they wanted. They said, 'Look in the box. There's no one there, is there?' 'Well, no,' said the woman. 'Well,' said they, 'when we went in, we heard a voice saying that the box was taken.'" Monsieur Moncharmin could not help smiling as he looked at Monsieur Richard, but Monsieur Richard did not smile. He himself had done too much in that way in his time not to recognize all the marks of one of those practical jokes which begin by amusing and end by enraging the victims. "Send for the box-keeper," he shouted, "this minute." She soon made her appearance. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Oh, Madame Giry. You know me well enough, sir. I'm the mother of little Giry, little Meg." "Never heard of her," the manager declared, "but that's no reason, Madame Giry, why I shouldn't ask you what happened last night." "Well, I'll tell you what happened," she said. "The ghost was annoyed again." It appeared that Madame Giry thought it quite natural that a voice should be heard to say that the box was taken when there was nobody in the box. Nobody could see the ghost in his box, but everybody could hear him. "You've spoken to the ghost, my good lady?" "Well, as I'm speaking to you now, my good sir," Madame Giry replied. "Well, when the ghost speaks to you, what does he say?" "Well, he tells me to bring him a footstool." This time Monsieur Richard burst out laughing, as did Monsieur Moncharmin and the secretary. "Instead of laughing," she cried indignantly, "you'd do better to do as Monsieur Poligny did, who found out for himself." "Tut," said Monsieur Moncharmin, "a ghost asking for a footstool? Then this ghost of yours is a woman?" "No, the ghost is a man." "How do you know?" "Well, he has a man's voice. Oh, such a lovely man's voice." "Well, and what did you do?" demanded Monsieur Richard. She replied, "Well, I brought him a footstool." The inspector, who was standing behind the box-keeper, was waving his arms to attract the attention of the managers. He tapped his forehead with a distressful forefinger to convey his opinion that the widow Giry was most certainly mad. Meanwhile, the worthy lady went on about her ghost. "At the end of the performance, he always gives me 2 francs, or sometimes 5, sometimes even 10. Some evenings I find flowers in the box, a rose that must have dropped from his lady's bodice, for he brings a lady with him sometimes. One day he left me a box of English sweets, which I'm very fond of. "Thank you, Madame Giry, that'll do. You can go." Madame Giry had bowed herself out, and the manager told the inspector that they had decided to dispense with that old mad woman's services. Then they told each other of the idea which they both had in mind, which was that they should look into that little matter of Box 5 themselves. Christine Daae did not immediately continue her triumph at the opera. She acted as though she were no longer the mistress of her own destiny, and as though she feared a fresh triumph. Raoul de Chagny tried in vain to meet her, but she showed herself nowhere. Then one morning she sent him the following note. "Monsieur, I have not forgotten the little boy who went into the sea to rescue my scarf. I am going to Perros in the fulfillment of a sacred duty. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the death of my poor father. He is buried there with his violin in the graveyard of the little church where we used to play as children." Raoul hurriedly consulted a railway guide, dressed as quickly as he could, and jumped into a cab which brought him to the Gare Montparnasse just in time to catch the morning train to Perros. As he sat in his compartment on the Brittany Express, he read Christine's note over and over again, smelling its perfume, recalling the sweet pictures of his childhood. The nearer he drew to her, the more fondly he remembered the story of the little Swedish singer. Dae's father was a great musician, perhaps without knowing it. Not a fiddler throughout the length and breadth of Scandinavia played as he did. His wife died when Christine was only 6, and he then cared only for his daughter and his music. He sold his patch of ground to search for fame and fortune as a rustic fiddler who tramped the roads with his pretty child who sang like an angel from heaven. One day, on the seashore of a village in a faraway corner of Brittany, a little boy, who was out with his governess, made her take a longer walk than she intended, for he could not tear himself away from the little girl whose pure, sweet voice seemed to bind him to her. There was a high wind that day, which suddenly blew Christine's scarf out to sea. She gave a cry and put out her arms, but the scarf was already far on the waves. Then she heard a voice say, "It's all right. I'll go and fetch your scarf out of the sea." She saw a little boy running fast in spite of the cries of his governess. He brought back her scarf. Boy and scarf were soaked through. Christine laughed merrily and kissed the little boy, who is none other than the Vicomte Raoul de Chagny. For the rest of the season, they saw each other and played together almost every day. They both had the same calm and dreamy cast of mind. They delighted in stories and old Breton legends. One of their favorite stories was about the angel of music, who played a part in all Daddy Dae's tales. Daddy Dae maintained that every great musician received a visit from the angel at least once in his life. Sometimes the angel leans over their cradle. Sometimes the angel comes much later, because the children are naughty, and sometimes he does not come at all, because the children have a bad heart or a bad conscience. No one ever sees the angel, but he is heard by those who are meant to hear him. Persons who are visited by the angel quiver with a thrill unknown to the rest of mankind. They cannot touch an instrument or open their mouths to sing without producing sounds that put all other human sounds to shame. Daddy Dae's eyes lit up when he said, "You will hear him one day, my child. When I am in heaven, I will send him to you." 3 years later, Raoul and Christine met again. Christine flushed at the sight of Raoul, who went up to her and kissed her. She ran into the garden and took refuge on a bench, a prey to feelings that stirred her young heart for the first time. Raoul followed her, and they talked till evening, very shyly. When they took leave of each other, Raoul said, "Mademoiselle, I shall never forget you." He went away regretting his words, for he knew that Christine could not be the wife of the Vicomte de Chagny. As for Christine, she tried not to think of him and devoted herself wholly to her art. Those who heard her prophesied that she would be the greatest singer in the world. One day, however, her father died, and suddenly she seemed to have lost, with him, her voice, her soul, and her genius. Then came her lightning flash in the gala performance of the opera, when an angel's voice was heard on earth for the delight of mankind and the utter capture of Raoul's heart. Why did she not recognize me that night, thought Raoul, and why had she written to me? He reached Perros at last, and walked into the smoky sitting-room of the Setting Sun Inn, where he saw Christine standing before him smiling and showing no astonishment. "So you have come," she said. Raoul, taking her little hand in his, said, "I love you, Christine. I cannot live without you." She replied gravely, "I did not make you come to tell me such things as that." There was something in Christine's attitude that seemed to Raoul not natural. However, he did not feel any hostility in her, far from it. The distressed affection shining in her eyes told him that. "When you saw me in your dressing-room, was that the first time you noticed me, Christine?" "No," she said. "I thought so," said Raoul. "But then why? When you saw me in your room at your feet, did you answer as though you did not know me? You won't answer? Well, I'll answer for you. It was because there was someone in the room who was in your way, the man to whom you said, 'I sing only for you.'" Christine seized Raoul's arm and clutched it with a strength which no one would have suspected in so frail a creature. She carried her hand to her heart, a prey to indescribable emotion. "Listen, Raoul," she said. "I have decided to tell you something serious, very serious. Do you remember the legend of the Angel of Music?" "I do indeed," he said. "Well, Raoul, my father is in heaven, and I have been visited by the Angel of Music. Yes, it's true, in my dressing room. That is where he comes to give me my lessons daily, and I have not been the only one to hear him." "Who else heard him, Christine?" "You, my friend. The other evening, it was he who was talking when you were listening behind the door. It was he who said, 'You must love me.' I then thought that I was the only one to hear his voice. If you had opened the door, you would have seen that there was nobody in the room." "That's true," he said. "I did open the door when you were gone, and I found no one in the room. So you see." "Well?" "Well, Christine, I think that somebody is making a game of you." She gave a cry and ran away, calling out, "Leave me! Leave me!" Raoul went to his room feeling very weary, very low-spirited, and very sad. He tried to sleep. It was about 11:30 when he heard Christine's door turn slowly on its hinges. Where could she be going at this hour? Softly opening his bedroom door, Raoul saw Christine's white form in the moonlight slipping along the passage. Raoul followed behind her, taking no pains to deaden the sound of his footsteps, anxious, in fact, that she should turn round and see him. But she seemed not to hear him, and acted exactly as though he were not there. She quietly left the inn and walked quickly up the road. She began almost to run until she came to the church. She knelt down by her father's grave, made the sign of the cross, and began to pray. The clock struck midnight, and at the last stroke Christine lifted her eyes to the sky and stretched out her arms as though in ecstasy. Raoul was wondering what the reason could be when he raised his own head and seemed drawn himself towards the invisible, which was playing the most perfect music. He remembered all Christine had told him of the Angel of Music. He then seemed to hear noises from some skulls in a heap of bones nearby. It was as though they were chuckling at him. He could not help shuddering, but it occurred to him that the musician he was hearing might be hiding behind that very heap of bones. Then a skull rolled to his feet. Then another. Then another. It was as if he were the mark of a ghastly game of bowls. He had an idea that a false step must have destroyed the balance of the structure behind which the musician was concealed, because he saw a shadow suddenly glide along the sacristy wall. He ran after it, and caught hold of a corner of its cloak. The shadow turned round. Raoul saw a terrible death's head, which darted a look at him from a pair of scorching eyes. He felt as if he were face to face with Satan. That was all he could remember the next morning, when they found him half frozen, more dead than alive, on the steps to the altar of the church. After Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin ran tear, they were almost alone in the huge, gloomy house, and a great silence surrounded them. A few rays of light, a wan, sinister light that seemed to have been stolen from an expiring luminary, fell through some opening or other upon an old tower that raised its pasteboard battlements on the stage. Everything in this deceptive light adopted a fantastic shape. They made for the left boxes, and from there stared silently at box 5 on the grand tier. In the semi-darkness of the theatre and the partial gloom that filled box 5, Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard saw a shape in the box. They said nothing, but spontaneously seized each other's hand. They stood like that for some minutes without moving, with their eyes fixed on the same point, but the figure had disappeared. Then they went out and, in the lobby, communicated their impressions to each other and talked about the shape. One had seen a thing like a death's head resting on the ledge of the box, whereas the other saw the shape of an old woman who looked like Madame Giry. they decided that they really had been the victims of an illusion, whereupon, without further delay, and laughing like madmen, they ran back to Box 5 on the grand tier, went inside, and found no shape of any kind. "Those people are making fools of us," Monsieur Richard exclaimed, and ended by saying, "It will be Faust on Saturday. Let us both see the performance from Box 5 on the grand tier." On Saturday morning, the joint managers found a letter from O.G. "My dear managers, so it is to be war between us. If you still care for peace, here is my ultimatum. It consists of the 4 following conditions. 1. You must give me back my private box. 2. The part of Margarita shall be sung this evening by Christine Daae. Never mind about Carlotta, she will be ill. 3. I absolutely insist upon the good and loyal services of Madame Giry, my box-keeper, whom you will reinstate in her functions forthwith. 4. Let me know by a letter handed to Madame Giry, who will see that it reaches me, that you accept, as your predecessors did, the conditions relating to my monthly allowance. If you refuse these conditions, you will give Faust tonight in a house with a curse upon it. Take my advice, and be warned in time. O.G. "Look here, I'm getting sick of him, shouted Richard, bringing his fist down on his office table. At that moment the door opened. Madame Giry entered and said hurriedly, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but I had this letter this morning from the opera ghost. He told me to come to you." She did not complete the sentence. She saw Firmin Richard's face, and it was ready to burst. He could not speak, but suddenly he acted. First, his left arm seized Madame Giry and made her describe so unexpected a semicircle that she uttered a despairing cry. Next, his right foot imprinted its sole on the black taffeta of a skirt which certainly had never before undergone a similar outrage in a similar place. The opera rang with her indignant yells. About the same time, the diva, Carlotta, rang for her maid, who brought her letters to her bed. Among them was an anonymous missive written in red ink in a hesitating, clumsy hand, which ran, "If you appear tonight, you must be prepared for a great misfortune at the moment when you open your mouth to sing, a misfortune worse than death." The letter took away Carlotta's appetite for breakfast, and she pushed away her chocolate. It was not the first letter of the kind which she had received, and she added to herself that she was not the woman to be intimidated. When she had finished thinking over the threat contained in the strange letter, she got up. The first thing she saw when looking out of her window was a hearse. She was very superstitious, and the hearse, coupled with the letter, convinced her that she was running the most serious dangers that evening. Monsieur Richard's private secretary called to ask after the diva's health, and returned with the assurance that she was perfectly well, and that, were she dying, she would sing the part of Margarita that evening. It was 5 o'clock when the post brought Carlotta a second anonymous letter in the same hand as the first. It was short, and said simply, "You have a bad cold. If you are wise, you will see that it is madness to try to sing tonight." Carlotta sneered, shrugged her handsome shoulders, and sang 2 or 3 notes to reassure herself. At the opera that night, the only unusual thing seemed to be the presence of Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin in Box 5. The opera began, and the famous baritone, Carolus Fontha, had hardly finished Dr. Faust's first appeal to the powers of darkness, when Monsieur Richard, who was sitting in the ghost's own chair, leaned over to his partner and asked him chaffingly, "Well, has the ghost whispered in your ear yet?" "Wait, don't be in such a hurry," replied Monsieur Moncharmin in the same gay tone. "The performance has only begun, and you know that the ghost does not usually come until the middle of the first act." Monsieur Richard smiled, and pointed to a fat, rather vulgar woman dressed in black, sitting in a stall in the middle of the auditorium with a man in a broadcloth frock coat on either side of her. "Who on earth are those?" asked Monsieur Moncharmin. "Those, my dear fellow, are my concierge, her husband, and her brother," replied Monsieur Richard. He explained that he had persuaded his concierge, in whom he had the greatest confidence, to come and take Madame Giry's place. The first act rang with gay song, but nothing unusual happened. Soon Carlotta crossed the stage and sang the only 2 lines allotted to her in the second act, and was received with enthusiastic applause, and this act also passed without incident. The managers left the box during the interval, and when they returned to their seats, the first thing they saw on entering the box was a box of English sweets on the little shelf of the ledge. Who had put it there? They asked the box keepers, but none of them knew. Then they went back to the shelf, and next to the box of sweets found an opera glass. They looked at each other. They had no inclination to laugh, and then they seemed to feel a curious sort of draught around them. They sat down in silence. The next act began with Christine Daae singing with a bunch of roses and lilacs in her hand. Christine, raising her head, saw Raoul de Chagny in his box, and from that moment her voice seemed less sure, less crystal clear than usual. "What a queer girl she is," said one of Carlotta's friends. "The other day she was divine, and tonight she's simply bleating." Raoul put his head under his hands and wept. Behind the curtain of his hands that veiled his boyish tears, he thought only of a letter which he received. It said, "My dear little playfellow, you must have the courage not to see me again, not to speak of me again, my dear Raoul. My life depends on it. Your life depends upon it. Your little Christine." Raoul's brother, the Count, sat behind him and viciously gnawed his moustache, shrugged his shoulders and frowned. For him, usually so cold and correct, to betray his inner feelings like that by outward signs, the Count must be very angry. He was. He had seen his brother return from a rapid and mysterious journey in an alarming state of health. The explanation that followed was unsatisfactory, and the Count asked Christine Daae for an appointment. She had the audacity to reply that she could not see either him or his brother. There were thunders of applause when Carlotta made her entrance in the third act. She flung herself into her part without restraint of modesty. Then suddenly a terrible thing happened. Faust had knelt on one knee to sing of his love to Margarita, and as Carlotta replied with her song, the terrible thing happened. Carlotta croaked like a toad. "Caw-ack!" There was consternation on Carlotta's face, and consternation on the faces of all the audience. Everyone felt that the thing was not natural, that there was witchcraft behind it. Poor, wretched, despairing, crushed Carlotta. She spent some seconds asking herself if she had really heard that note, that sound, that infernal noise issue from her throat. Meanwhile, in Box 5, Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard had turned very pale. Monsieur Moncharmin's hair stood on end. Monsieur Richard wiped the perspiration from his forehead. The ghost was there, around them, behind them, beside them. They felt his presence without seeing him. They heard his breath close, close, close to them. They were sure that there were 3 people in the box. What was going to happen? This happened. "Caw-ack!" They felt that they were smarting under the ghost's attacks. They were waiting for the catastrophe. The ghost had told them it would come. Carlotta's voice alone once more filled the resounding house. "I feel without alarm. Caw-ack! Caw-ack!" The 2 managers collapsed in their chairs. The ghost was chuckling behind their backs, the mouthless voice saying, "She is singing tonight to bring the chandelier down." With one accord, they raised their eyes to the ceiling and uttered a terrible cry. The immense mass of the chandelier was slipping down, coming toward them. It plunged from the ceiling and came smashing into the middle of the stalls amid 1,000 shouts of terror. It crashed down upon the head of the wretched woman whom Monsieur Richard had appointed to succeed Madame Giry, the ghost's box-keeper. She died on the spot. That tragic evening was bad for everybody. Carlotta fell ill. As for Christine Daae, she disappeared after the performance. Raoul, of course, was the first to be astonished at the prima donna's absence. He wrote to her at Madame Valerius's apartment where she lived, but received no reply. He resolved, come what might, to inquire in person at the apartment. He trembled as he rang the bell, and was ushered into an ill-lit room where he at once recognized the good, kind face of Christine's benefactress, Madame Valerius. "Monsieur de Chagny," she cried gaily, putting out both her hands to her visitor. "Ah, it's heaven that sends you here. We can talk of her." "Madame, where is Christine?" he asked at once. The old lady replied calmly, She is with her good genius." "What good genius?" exclaimed poor Raoul. "Why, the angel of music. Why don't you come near me as you used to when you were a little boy? I'm very fond of you, Monsieur Raoul, you know, and so is Christine, too." He asked in a low voice, "What makes you think that Christine is fond of me, madame?" "Well, she used to speak of you every day." "Really? What did she tell you?" "Well, she told me that you had made her a proposal." The good old lady began laughing wholeheartedly. Raoul sprang from his chair, flushing to the temples, suffering agonies. "If you're angry with me for laughing, I beg your pardon. Did you think that Christine was free?" "Is Christine engaged to be married?" the wretched Raoul said in a choking voice. Why, no. The angel of music forbids her to marry. He tells her that if she got married, she would never hear him again." "Madam, will you have the goodness to tell me where that genius lives?" She raised her eyes and said, "In heaven." He now realized the possible state of mind of a girl brought up between a superstitious fiddler and a visionary old lady, and he shuddered when he thought of the consequences of it all. He hurriedly took leave of Madame Valerius. He walked home to his brother's house in a pitiful state. The angel of music. He knew him now. It was, beyond doubt, some unspeakable tenor, a good-looking jackanapes who mouthed and simpered as he sang. And she, what a bold and damnable sly creature! His brother, the Count, consoled him and suggested taking him out to dinner. Raoul dressed in frantic haste, prepared to forget his distress by flinging himself, as people say, into the vortex of pleasure. Alas, he was a sorry guest, and leaving his brother early, he found himself by 10 o'clock in the evening in a cab. The road seemed deserted and very bright under the moonlight. Then suddenly a carriage turned the corner of the road and came quietly in his direction at walking pace. As it approached, he saw that a woman was leaning her head from the window. "Christine!" he called out again. "Christine!" No reply. She had passed without answering his cry. Nothing was colder than his heart, nothing half so dead. He had loved an angel, and now he despised a woman. He was thinking of dying, and he was only 20 years old. His valet found him in the morning sitting on his bed. He had not undressed, and the servant feared at the sight of his face that some disaster had occurred. Raoul snatched his letters from the man's hands. He had recognized Christine's paper and handwriting. She wrote, "Dear, go to the masked ball at the opera on the night after tomorrow. At 12 o'clock, be in the little room behind the chimney place of the big crush room. Wear a white domino and be carefully masked. As you love me, do not let yourself be recognized. Christine." Raoul read it over again with fevered eyes. The sombre picture, which he had for a moment imagined of a Christine forgetting her duty to herself, made way for his original conception of an unfortunate, innocent child, the victim of imprudence and exaggerated sensibility. To what extent at this time was she really a victim? Whose prisoner was she? What monster had carried her off, and by what means? Raoul's fingers clutched at his flesh, above his jealous heart. In his inexperience, he now asked himself with terror what game the girl was playing. Up to what point could an opera singer make a fool of a good-natured young man, quite new to love? Oh, misery! Thus did Raoul's thoughts fly from one extreme to another. He no longer knew whether to pity Christine or to curse her. At all events, he bought a white domino. The hour of the appointment came at last. With his face in a mask, he did not wait long. A black domino passed and gave a quick squeeze to the tips of his fingers. He understood that it was she, and he followed her. They passed through the great crush room and noticed a group crowding round a person whose disguise, eccentric air, and gruesome appearance were causing a sensation. It was a man dressed all in scarlet, with a huge hat and feathers on top of a wonderful death's head. From his shoulders hung an immense red velvet cloak, which was embroidered in gold letters, "Don't touch me. I am Red Death stalking abroad." Raoul passed in front of the funereal masquerader, who had just happened to turn in his direction, and he nearly exclaimed out loud, "The death's head of Perros!" The black domino hurried her pace and Raoul's as though they were being pursued. They went up 2 floors. Here the black domino opened the door of a private box. She tried to close the door, but Raoul prevented her, for he had seen a red foot, followed by another, and slowly, majestically, the whole scarlet dress of Red Death met his eyes. Raoul exclaimed, "This time he shall not escape me." "Whom do you mean by he?" Christine asked. "Who shall not escape you?" "Who?" he repeated angrily. "Why, he, the man who hides behind that hideous mask of death, the evil genius of the churchyard of Perros, Red Death, in a word, madam, your friend, your angel of music. But I shall snatch off his mask, and I shall know whom you love and who loves you." "Oh, in the name of our love, Raoul, you shall not." He stopped. What had she said? In the name of their love? Never before had she confessed that she loved him. Pooh! Her only object was to gain a few seconds. She wished to give the Red Death time to escape. "You lie, madam," he said, "for you do not love me, and you have never loved me. What a poor fellow I must be to let you mock and flout me as you have done. I despise you." She allowed him to insult her. She thought of but one thing to keep him from leaving the box. "Look here," he cried. "Can't you tell me what all this means? What have you been doing this past fortnight? What is this tale about the angel of music? What is this farce?" Christine simply took off her mask and said, "Dear, it is a tragedy." Raoul now saw her face and could not restrain an exclamation of surprise and terror. The fresh complexion of former days was gone. A mortal pallor covered those features, which he had known so charming and so gentle, and sorrow had furrowed them with pitiless lines, and traced dark and unspeakably sad shadows under her eyes. My dearest," he moaned, holding out his arms, "forgive me." "Some day, perhaps," she said, resuming her mask. Then she went away, forbidding him with a gesture to follow her. He watched her till she was out of sight. Then he turned down the passage that led to her dressing-room. He tapped at the door. There was no answer. He entered, and the room was empty. Suddenly he heard steps in the passage, and had only time enough to hide in the inner room. Christine entered. She sighed, and Raoul heard her murmur, "Poor Eric." At first he thought he must be mistaken. If anyone was to be pitied, it was he, Raoul. Suddenly she seemed to be listening. Raoul also listened. A faint singing seemed to issue from the walls. He heard a voice, a very beautiful, very soft, very captivating male voice. The voice came nearer and nearer, until it was in the room in front of Christine. Christine rose and addressed the voice. "Here I am, Eric. I am ready." Raoul, peeping from behind the curtain, could not believe his eyes, which showed him nothing. The voice, without a body, went on singing. Raoul began to understand how Christine was able to appear one evening before the stupefied audience with accents of a beauty hitherto unknown, of a superhuman exaltation, while doubtless still under the influence of the mysterious and invisible master. The strains went through Raoul's heart, and he succeeded in drawing back the curtain that hid him, and he walked to where Christine stood. She began moving toward her image in the mirror. The 2 Christines, the real one and the reflection, ended by touching. Raoul followed, and put out his arms to clasp the 2 in one embrace, but by a sort of dazzling miracle that sent him staggering, Raoul was suddenly flung back while an icy blast swept over his face. He rushed back up to the glass. Christine had disappeared. Raoul struck at the walls. The room still echoed with a distant, passionate singing. The tears were streaming down his young cheeks as he expressed aloud, "Who is this Eric?" The day after Christine had vanished before his eyes in a sort of dazzlement that still made him doubt the evidence of his senses, Monsieur Raoul de Chagny called again at Madame Valerius. He came upon a charming picture. Christine herself was seated by the bedside of the old lady. The pink and white had returned to the young girl's cheeks. The dark rings round her eyes had disappeared. Raoul no longer recognized the tragic face of the day before. He stood there dumbfounded, then exclaimed, There seems to be a terrible mystery around us, madam. Around you, around Christine. A mystery much more to be feared than any number of ghosts or genii." Madame Valerius turned a terrified face to Christine, who had already run to her adopted mother and was holding her in her arms. "You must promise, Christine," implored Raoul, "to remain under our protection in the future. It's the only thing that can reassure your mother and me." "That is a promise which I refuse to make you," said the young girl haughtily. "I am mistress of my own actions, Monsieur de Chagny. You have no right to control them. There is only one man in the world who has the right to demand an account of me, my husband. Well, I have no husband, and I never mean to marry." She threw out her hands to emphasize her words, and Raoul turned pale, because he had caught sight of a plain gold ring on Christine's finger. "You have no husband, and yet you wear a wedding ring?" "That's a present," she said, blushing once more and vainly striving to hide her embarrassment. "I saw your ecstasy at the sound of his voice, Christine, the voice that came from the wall. You are under a very dangerous spell, for I myself, when I heard it, was so much fascinated by it that you vanished before my eyes without my seeing which way you passed. Christine, tell us, to whom does that voice belong? Come, Christine, the name of the man who had the audacity to put a ring on your finger." "Monsieur de Chagny," the girl declared coldly, "you shall never know." "The name of your angel of music, mademoiselle, is Eric." Christine turned white as a sheet and stammered. "Who told you? When you went to your dressing room at the opera ball, did you not say, 'Poor Eric'? Well, Christine, there was a poor Raoul who overheard you." "Unhappy man," she exclaimed. "Do you want to be killed? Raoul, forget the man's voice and do not even remember its name. You must never try to fathom the mystery of the man's voice. Swear to me that you will never come to my dressing room unless I send for you." "Then you promise to send for me sometimes, Christine?" "I promise." He kissed her hands and went away, cursing Eric and resolving to be patient. The next day he saw her at the opera. She was still wearing the plain gold ring. He talked to her of the plans which he was forming, of his future, of his career. He told her of a polar expedition, and said that he would be leaving France in 3 weeks, or a month at latest. "Perhaps we shall never see each other again," he said. "I may die during that expedition." "Or I," she said simply. "In a month we shall have to say goodbye forever. Unless, Christine, we pledge our faith and wait for each other forever." "Hush, Raoul. We shall never be married, that is understood." Then she clapped her hands with childish glee. But, she continued, "if we cannot be married, we can be engaged. Nobody will know but ourselves, Raoul. There have been plenty of secret marriages. Why not a secret engagement? We are engaged, dear, for a month." Raoul jumped at the idea. "Mademoiselle, I have the honor to ask for your hand." "Oh, Raoul, how happy we shall be! We must play at being engaged." And they did. It was the prettiest game in the world, and they enjoyed it like the children that they were. They played at hearts as other children might play at ball, only as it was really their 2 hearts that they flung to and fro, they had to be very, very handy to catch them each time without hurting them. They met every day in the singer's dressing room. She wandered with him hand in hand through her empire at the opera house. It was artificial, but immense, covering 17 stories from the ground floor to the roof, and inhabited by an army of subjects. She moved among them like a popular queen, encouraging them all in their labors. Once, when they were passing before an open trapdoor on the stage, Raoul stopped over the dark cavity. "You've shown me over the upper part of your empire, Christine, but there are strange stories told of the lower part. Shall we go down?" She caught him in her arms, as though she feared to see him disappear down the black hole, and in a trembling voice whispered, "Never! I will not have you go there. Besides, it's not mine. Everything that is underground belongs to him." She literally dragged him away. Suddenly, the trap-door was closed, and so quickly that they did not even see the hand that worked it. They were quite dazed. "Perhaps he was there," Raoul said. "Oh, no, he shut himself up. He's working." "What's he working at?" "Oh, something terrible, but it's all the better for us. When he's working at that, he sees nothing. He does not eat, drink, or breathe for days and nights at a time. He becomes a living dead man and has no time to amuse himself with the trapdoors. I will remove you from his power, Christine. I swear it. You shall not think of him any more. Is it possible? She allowed herself this doubt, which was an encouragement, while dragging the young man up to the topmost floor of the theatre, far, very far from the trapdoors, until they reached the roof. Despite the care which she took to look behind her at every moment, she failed to see a shadow which followed her like her own shadow, which stopped when she stopped, which started again when she did, and which made no more noise than a well-conducted shadow should. It was a gorgeous spring evening up on the roof. Yet Christine shivered and nestled in Raoul's arms with a moan. I'm afraid of going back to live with him, in the ground. Time is at hand. I have only a day left, and if I do not go, he will come and fetch me with his voice. She wrung her hands in anguish, while Raoul pressed her to his heart. I will let him hear me sing tomorrow evening, and then we will go away. You must come and fetch me in my dressing room at midnight exactly. You must promise me that even if I refuse, you shall carry me off by force. She gave a sigh, to which it seemed to her that another sigh behind her replied. Didn't you hear? Her teeth chattered. No, said Raoul. I heard nothing. Tell me how you saw him first, he continued. She began. I had heard him for 3 months without seeing him. I could not find the voice. I looked everywhere, inside and outside my dressing room. It not only sang, but it spoke to me and answered my questions like a real man's voice, with this difference, that it was beautiful as the voice of an angel, the voice which I was expecting and which my father had promised me. The voice and I became great friends, and it asked leave to give me lessons every day. I agreed, and never failed to keep the appointment which it gave me in my dressing room. Well, in a few weeks' time, I hardly knew myself when I sang. It would say, "Wait and see. We shall astonish Paris." I waited and lived on in a sort of ecstatic dream. It was then that I saw you for the first time one evening in the house. I was so glad that I never thought of concealing my delight when I reached my dressing room. Unfortunately, the voice was there before me, and soon noticed by my air that something had happened. Then the voice was silent. I was terrified lest it had gone for good. The next day, Christine continued with a sigh, I went back to my dressing room in a very pensive frame of mind. The voice was there. It spoke to me with great sadness and told me plainly that if I must bestow my heart on earth, there was nothing for the voice to do but to go back to heaven. I feared nothing so much as that I might never hear it again. I had thought about my love for you and realized all the useless danger of it. Your position in society forbade me to contemplate the possibility of ever marrying you. Meanwhile, the hours during which the voice taught me were spent in a divine frenzy, until at last the voice said to me, "You can now, Christine Daae, give to men a little of the music of heaven." I didn't know how it was that Carlotta did not come to the theatre that night, nor why I was called upon to sing in her stead, but I sang with a rapture I'd never known before. I felt myself fainting, said Christine. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, you were by my side. But the voice was also there, Raoul. I was afraid for your sake. I dared not recognize you, and began to laugh when you reminded me that you had picked up my scarf in the sea. Alas, I was no longer mistress of myself. I had become his thing. You remember the terrible evening when Carlotta thought that she'd been turned into a toad on the stage, when the house was suddenly plunged into darkness through the chandelier crashing to the floor? Well, my first thought was for you and the voice. I knew that you were not in danger, but I thought to myself, the chandelier may have come down upon the voice. Then I thought that if the voice was safe, it would be sure to be in my dressing room, and I rushed back to it. Suddenly, I heard a long, beautiful wail which I knew well. It seemed to command me, personally, to come, to stand up and come to it. It retreated, and I followed. I came, and this was the extraordinary thing. My dressing room, as I moved, seemed to lengthen out. Evidently it must have been an effect of the mirrors, and suddenly I was outside the room without knowing how. I was in a dark passage. I was frightened, and I cried out, and suddenly a stone-cold, bony thing seized my wrist and did not let go. I was dragged toward a little red light, and I saw that I was in the hands of a man, wrapped in a large cloak, and wearing a mask that hid his whole face. My mouth opened to scream, but a hand closed it, a hand that smelt of death. Then I fainted away. When I opened my eyes, we were still surrounded by darkness. I asked, "Who are you? Where is the voice?" The black shape lifted me onto a white shape. A glad neighing greeted my astounded ears. I recognized the white horse out of the Profeta. There was a rumor in the theatre that it had been stolen by the opera ghost. I believed in the voice, but had never believed in the ghost. I never imagined that the voice and the ghost were one. I calculated that we were in a narrow circular gallery, probably running all round the opera, which is immense underground. We seemed to turn and turn, going down a spiral stair into the very heart of the earth. I felt a moistness in the air, and when the darkness lifted, we were on the edge of a lake. I saw a little boat fastened to an iron ring on the wharf. The man's shape lifted me onto the boat, and he rowed with a quick, powerful stroke. His eyes under the mask never left me. We touched the shore, and I was dazed by a dazzling light. I was in the middle of a drawing-room adorned with nothing but flowers. He said, "Don't be afraid, Christine. You are in no danger." It was the voice. The man said, "You are in no danger so long as you do not touch the mask." And the voice which I had recognized under the mask, was on its knees before me, and was a man. I began to cry. The man, still kneeling, must have understood the cause of my tears, for he said, "It is true, Christine. I am not an angel, nor a genius, nor a ghost. I am Eric." "Oh, I hate him!" cried Raoul. "And you, Christine, tell me, do you hate him too?" "No," said Christine simply. There was an appalling silence between the three of them, the two who spoke, and the shadow that listened behind them. Then she said, "That is the terrible thing about it. He fills me with horror, and I do not hate him. He loves me. He lays at my feet an immense and tragic love. He has imprisoned me with him underground for love." I was made to remember that, though he was not an angel, nor a ghost, nor a genius, he remained the voice, for he sang, and that night we did not exchange another word. He sang me to sleep. When I woke up, I was alone, lying on a sofa in a simply furnished little bedroom. I saw on the chest of drawers a note in red ink which said, "My dear Christine, you need have no concern as to your fate. You have no better nor more respectful friend in the world than myself. I'm going out shopping to fetch you all the things that you can need." Well, he returned with his arms full of boxes and parcels and arranged them on the bed, while I overwhelmed him with abuse and called upon him to take off his mask. He replied serenely, "You shall never see Eric's face." He said that he loved me, but that he would never tell me so except when I allowed him, and that the rest of the time would be devoted to music. Then I saw the keyboard of an organ which filled one whole side of the wall. On the desk was a music book covered with red notes. I asked leave to look at it, and read, "Don Juan Triumphant." "Yes," he said, "I compose sometimes. I began that work 20 years ago. Let us sing something from the opera, Christine Daae." He spoke these last words as though he were flinging an insult at me. We at once began the duet in Othello, and already the catastrophe was upon us. Eric's black mask made me think of the natural mask of the Moor of Venice. It was Othello himself. Suddenly I felt a need to see beneath the mask. I wanted to know the face of the voice, and with a movement which I was utterly unable to control, swiftly my fingers tore away the mask. Oh, horror! 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 If I live to be 100, I shall always hear the superhuman cry of grief and rage which he uttered when the terrible sight appeared before my eyes. Imagine, if you can, Red Death's mask at the opera ball, suddenly coming to life in order to express with the 4 black holes of its eyes, its nose, and its mouth the extreme anger, the mighty fury of a demon, and not a ray of light coming from the sockets. He hissed mad, incoherent words and curses at me. "Feast your eyes, glut your soul on my cursed ugliness. When a woman has seen me as you have, she belongs to me."
When I turned away my head and begged for mercy, he drew it to him, brutally, twisting his dead fingers into my hair, and then he hissed at me. "Perhaps you think I have another mask. Well," he roared, "tear it off, as you did the other." And he seized my hands and dug them into his awful face. "It is a corpse that loves you and adores you and will never, never leave you. As long as you thought me handsome, you could have come back. I know you would have come back, but now that you know my hideousness, you would run away for good, so I shall keep you here. Why did you want to see me? Oh, mad Christine, who wanted to see me, when my own father never saw me, and when my mother, so as not to see me, made me a present of my first mask." He had let go of me at last, and was dragging himself about the floor, uttering terrible sobs. Then he crawled away like a snake and went into his room. Presently I heard the sound of the organ. He had rushed to his masterpiece, his Don Juan triumphant, to forget the horror of the moment. It intoxicated me. "Eric," I cried, "show me your face without fear. If ever again I shiver when I look at you, it will be because I am thinking of the splendor of your genius." Well, then Eric turned round, for he believed me, and I also had faith in myself. He fell at my feet, with words of love in his dead mouth. He kissed the hem of my dress and did not see that I closed my eyes. My lies were as hideous as the monster who inspired them. I burned his mask, and I managed so well that even when he was not singing, he tried to catch my eye like a dog sitting by its master. Then, at last, after a fortnight of that horrible captivity, during which I was filled with pity, enthusiasm, despair, and horror by turns, he believed me when I said, "I will come back." "And you went back, Christine," groaned Raoul. "Yes, dear. And I must tell you that it was not his frightful threats when setting me free that helped me to keep my word, but the harrowing sob which he gave on the threshold of the tomb. That sob attached me to the unfortunate man more than I myself suspected when saying good-bye to him. Poor Eric. Poor Eric." "Christine," said Raoul, rising, "you tell me that you love me, but do you really love me? If Eric were good-looking, would you love me, Christine?" She rose in turn, put her two trembling arms around the young man's neck and said, "Oh, my betrothed of a day, if I did not love you, I would not give you my lips. Take them, for the first time and the last." He kissed her lips. High up above them, an immense night-bird stared at them with blazing eyes. Raoul and Christine ran, eager to escape from the roof and the blazing eyes that showed only in the dark. Suddenly a queer-looking form stood before them and blocked the road. No, not this way. The form, which wore a sort of long frock coat and a pointed cap, said, "Quick! Go away, quickly!" Christine was already dragging Raoul, compelling him to start running again. "Who is that man?" he asked. Christine replied, "It's the Persian." "What's he doing here?" "Nobody knows. He's always in the opera." They came to Christine's dressing-room. "Raoul, you must run away with me in spite of myself. Is that understood? I shall be here at 12 tomorrow night. I shall keep my promise whatever happens." Suddenly Christine changed colour. A mortal pallor overspread her features. "Oh, heavens!" she cried. "Eric! Eric, have pity on me!" She wrung her fingers, repeating with a distraught air, "Oh, heaven! Oh, heaven!" "But what is it? What is it?" Raoul implored. "The ring. The gold ring he gave me." "Oh, so Eric gave you that ring?" "You know he did, Raoul. But what you don't know is that when he gave it to me, he said, 'I give you back your liberty, Christine, on condition that this ring is always on your finger. As long as you keep it, you will be protected against all danger, and Eric will remain your friend. But woe to you if you ever part with it, for Eric will have his revenge.' Oh, my dear, the ring is gone. Oh, woe to us both." Raoul was no coward, and yet he trembled. The next day, Raoul was devoted to his preparations for their impending flight.
The horse, the carriage, the coachman, the provisions, the luggage, the money required for the journey, and the road to be taken, as he had resolved not to go by train, so as to throw the ghost off the scent. Later that night he arrived at the opera. They were giving Faust, as it happened, before a splendid house. Christine Daae met with a rather cold reception. The singer noticed this unfavourable attitude of a portion of the house and was confused by it. She lost her self-assurance more and more. She trembled. She felt on the verge of a breakdown. In front of the house, people remembered the catastrophe that had befallen Carlotta at the end of that act, and the historic co-act which had momentarily interrupted her career in Paris. Just then, Carlotta made her entrance in a box facing the stage. A sensational entrance. Poor Christine raised her eyes upon this fresh subject of excitement. She recognized her rival. She thought she saw a sneer on her lips. That saved her. She forgot everything in order to triumph once more. From that moment the prima donna sang with all her heart and soul. She tried to surpass all that she had done till then, and she succeeded. In the center of the amphitheater, a man stood up and remained standing, facing the singer. It was Raoul. Christine, her arms outstretched, her throat filled with music, the glory of her hair falling over her bare shoulders, uttered a divine cry. It was at that moment that the stage suddenly plunged into darkness. It happened so quickly that the spectators hardly had time to utter a sound of stupefaction, for the stage was at once lit up again, but Christine Daae was no longer there. Raoul uttered a cry. The rest of the audience waited amid an indescribable hubbub. At last, Carolus Fonta stepped to the conductor's desk and in a sad and serious voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, an unprecedented event has taken place and thrown us into a state of the greatest alarm. Our sister artist, Christine Daae, has disappeared before our eyes, and nobody can tell us how." Before the extraordinary occurrences that took place that evening, the managers, Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin, had already undergone a disagreeable change, due not only to the fall of the chandelier on the famous night of the gala performance. One morning the managers found on their table a note from O.G. himself. "The time has come to carry out the clause in the memorandum book. Please put 20 notes of 1,000 francs each into this envelope, seal it with your own seal, and hand it to Madame Giry, who will do what is necessary." The managers did not hesitate. They seized this opportunity of laying hands on the mysterious blackmailer. They put 20,000 francs into the envelope, and without asking for explanations, handed it to Madame Giry, who had been reinstated in her functions. She went straight to the ghost box and placed the precious envelope on the little shelf attached to the ledge. The two managers were hidden in such a way that they did not lose sight of the envelope for a second during the performance, and even afterward. The envelope had not moved. At last they became tired of waiting and opened the envelope, after ascertaining that the seals had not been broken. The 20 real notes were gone, and had been replaced by 20 notes of the Bank of St. Farce. The manager's rage and fright were unmistakable. Monsieur Richard exclaimed, "O.G. has won the first game. We will win the second. Next time I shall have taken my precautions." The next time fell on the same day that beheld the disappearance of Christine Daae. In the morning, a note from the ghost reminded them that the money was due. The note was accompanied by the usual envelope. They had only to insert the notes. This was done about half an hour before the curtain rose on the first act of Faust. Then Madame Giry was sent for. "Good evening, gentlemen. It's for the envelope, I suppose." "Yes, Madame Giry," said Richard most amiably. "And something else besides. I have a little question to put to you. Are you still on good terms with the ghost?" "Couldn't be better, sir," she replied. "Couldn't be better. Ah, well, we're delighted. Look here, Madame Giry," said Richard, in a tone of making an important confidence. "We may just as well tell you, among ourselves, well, you're no fool. The story of the ghost is all humbug, isn't it?" "Well, still between ourselves, it's lasted long enough. The name of the man whose accomplice you are, Madame Giry."
"I am the ghost's accomplice? I? His accomplice in what, pray?"
"How much does he give you for bringing him that envelope?"
10 francs.
"We should like to know," continued Monsieur Richard, "for what extraordinary reason you have given yourself body and soul to this ghost. Madame Giry's friendship and devotion are not to be bought for 5 francs or 10 francs.
"That's true enough," she replied, "and I can tell you the reason, sir. There's no disgrace in it. Well, it's like this. It was in box 5 one evening. I found a letter addressed to myself, a sort of note written in red ink. I needn't read the letter to you, sir. I know it by heart."
Madame Giry, drawing herself up, recited the letter with touching eloquence. "Madame, 1832, Mademoiselle Marie Taglioni, a dancer, became Comtesse Gilbert des Voisins. 1846, La Sota, a dancer, married a brother of the King of Spain. 1870, Teresa Hessier, a dancer, married Don Fernando, brother to the King of Portugal. 1885, Meg Giry, Empress." "You have never seen him? He speaks to you, and you believe all he says?" asked Moncharmin. "Yes," she replied. Monsieur Richard took over. "Madame Giry, do you know what is in this envelope?" "Why, of course not," she said. Madame Giry looked into the envelope with a lacklustre eye, which soon recovered its brilliance. 1,000-franc notes!" she cried. "Now, I will tell you the second reason why I sent for you," Monsieur Richard continued. "Madame Giry, I'm going to have you arrested as a thief." "Have me arrested?" The mouth that spoke those words seemed to spit the 3 teeth that were left to it into Richard's face. Then Madame Giry caught Monsieur Richard a mighty box on the ear before Monsieur Moncharmin had time to intervene. But it was not the withered hand of the angry old beldame that fell on the managerial ear, but the envelope itself, which opened with the blow, scattering the banknotes, which escaped in a fantastic whirl of giant butterflies. The 2 managers gave a shout, and the same thought made them both go on their knees, feverishly picking up and hurriedly examining the precious scraps of paper. "Are they still genuine, Moncharmin?" Above their heads, Madame Giry's 3 teeth were clashing in a noisy contest, full of hideous interjections. But all that could be clearly distinguished was this leitmotif, "I, a thief! I, a thief! I—" She choked with rage. "In any case," she yelped, "you, Monsieur Richard, ought to know better than I where the 20,000 francs went to." "I?" asked Richard, astounded. "And how should I know?" Moncharmin, looking severe and dissatisfied, at once insisted that the good lady should explain herself. As for Richard, who felt himself turning red under Moncharmin's eyes, he took Madame Giry by the wrist and shook it violently. He roared, "Why should I know better than you where the 20,000 francs went to?" "Because they went into your pocket," gasped the old woman, looking at him as if he were the devil incarnate. "How can you suspect my partner, Monsieur Richard, of putting 20,000 francs in his pocket?" "I never said that," declared Madame Giry, "seeing that it was myself who put the 20,000 francs into Monsieur Richard's pocket." Madame Giry, like the martyr that she was, raised her head, her face beaming with faith in her own innocence. "You tell me there were 20,000 francs in the envelope which I put into Monsieur Richard's pocket, but I tell you again that I knew nothing about it." "Aha!" said Richard, suddenly assuming a swaggering air which Moncharmin did not like. "I knew nothing either." "Yes," the terrible dame agreed. "Yes, it's true. We neither of us knew anything, but you must have ended by finding out." Richard would certainly have swallowed Madame Giry alive if Moncharmin had not been there. But Moncharmin protected her. He resumed his questions. "What sort of envelope did you put into Monsieur Richard's pocket?" "It was not the one which we gave, the one which you took to box 5 before our eyes, and yet that was the one which contained the 20,000 francs." "I beg your pardon. The envelope which Monsieur Richard gave me was the one which I slipped into Monsieur Richard's pocket," explained Madame Giry. The one which I took to the ghost box was another envelope, just like it, which the ghost gave me beforehand, and which I hid up my sleeve." So saying, Madame Giry took from her sleeve an envelope ready prepared and similarly addressed to that containing the 20,000 francs. The managers took it from her. They examined it and saw that it was fastened with seals stamped with their own managerial seal. They opened it. It contained 20 Bank of St. Farce notes, like those which had so much astounded them the month before. "How simple," said Richard. "How simple," said Moncharmin. "Of course," exclaimed Richard, looking a little pale. "It's very clever of O.G. The problem which he had to solve was this: how to do away with any dangerous intermediary between the man who gives the 20,000 francs and the man who receives it. By far the best thing he could hit upon was to come and take the money from my pocket without my noticing it, as I myself did not know that it was there. It's wonderful." "Oh, wonderful, no doubt," Moncharmin agreed. "Only you forget, Richard, that I provided 10,000 francs of the 20, and that nobody put anything in my pocket." Moncharmin's last phrase so clearly expressed the suspicion in which he now held his partner that it was bound to cause a stormy explanation, at the end of which it was agreed that Richard should yield to all Moncharmin's wishes with the object of helping him to discover the miscreant who was victimizing them. It was arranged that Richard should repeat the exact movements which he had made on the night of the disappearance of the first 20,000 francs, and second, that Moncharmin should not for an instant lose sight of Richard's coat-tail pocket, into which Madame Giry was to slip the 20,000 francs. Monsieur Richard went and placed himself at the identical spot where he had stood when he bowed to the Under-Secretary for the Fine Arts. Monsieur Moncharmin took up his position a few steps behind him. Monsieur Richard was bending and bowing and scraping and walking backward, just as if he had had the high and mighty minister, the Under-Secretary for Fine Arts, before him. Only, though these marks of politeness would have created no astonishment if the Under-Secretary of State had really been in front of Monsieur Richard, they caused an easily comprehensible amazement to the spectators of this very natural but quite inexplicable scene when Monsieur Richard had nobody in front of him. Monsieur Richard bowed to nobody, bent his back before nobody, and walked backward before nobody, and a few steps behind him, Monsieur Moncharmin did the same thing. This novel method of walking behind the scenes, adopted by the managers, attracted attention, but the managers themselves thought of nothing but their 20,000 francs. Moncharmin instructed Monsieur Richard. "You walk ahead, and I'll walk immediately behind you. I won't leave you by a step." "But in that case," exclaimed Richard, "they will never steal our 20,000 francs." "I should hope not, indeed," declared Moncharmin. "Then what we are doing is absurd." 2 minutes later, the joint managers locked themselves into their office. Richard said, "Look here, I'm thinking of what I might think if, like last time, after spending the evening alone with you, you brought me home, and if, at the moment of parting, I perceived that 20,000 francs had disappeared from my coat pocket, like last time." "And what might you think?" asked Moncharmin, crimson with rage. "I might think that as you hadn't left me by a foot's breadth, and as, by your own wish, you were the only one to approach me, like last time, I might think that, if that 20,000 francs was no longer in my pocket, it stood a very good chance of being in yours." Moncharmin leapt up at the suggestion. "Oh!" he shouted. "A safety pin! To fasten you up with! A safety pin!" "You want to fasten me with a safety pin?" "Yes, to fasten you to the 20,000 francs. Then, whether it's here, or on the drive from here to your place, or at your place, you will feel the hand that pulls at your pocket, and you will see if it's mine. Oh, so you're suspecting me now, are you? A safety pin!" Moncharmin first locked the door again. Then he knelt down behind Richard's back. "I hope," he said, "that the notes are still there." "Look for yourself," said Richard. "I refuse to touch them." Moncharmin took the envelope from Richard's pocket and drew out the banknotes with a trembling hand. He felt reassured on finding that they were all there and quite genuine. He put them back in the tail pocket and pinned them with great care. Then he sat down behind Richard's coat-tails and kept his eyes fixed on them while Richard, sitting at his writing table, did not stir. "A little patience, Richard," said Moncharmin. "We have only a few minutes to wait. The clock will soon strike 12. Last time we left at the last stroke of 12. At that moment, the clock on the mantelpiece gave its warning click, and the first stroke of 12 struck. The two managers shuddered. The perspiration streamed down their foreheads. When the clock stopped, they gave a sigh and rose from their chairs. "I think we can go now," said Moncharmin. "Before we go, do you mind if I look in your pocket?" "But of course, Moncharmin, you must." "Well, I can feel the pin. Yes, I can feel the pin, but I can't feel the notes." Richard tore off his coat. The two managers turned the pocket inside out. The pocket was empty. "The ghost," muttered Moncharmin. But Richard suddenly sprang upon his partner. "No one but you has touched my pocket. Give me back my 20,000 francs. "On my soul," sighed Moncharmin, "on my soul, I swear that I haven't got it." Meanwhile, Raoul's first thought, after Christine Daae's fantastic disappearance, was to accuse Eric. He rushed onto the stage in a fit of love and despair. "Christine! Christine!" he moaned, calling to her as he felt that she must be calling to him from the depths of that dark pit to which the monster had carried her. People pushed him aside, laughing. They thought the poor lover's brain was gone. Hideous thoughts flashed through Raoul's congested brain. Of course! Eric must have discovered their secret, must have known that Christine had played him false. What a vengeance would be his! He ran to the singer's dressing room. "Christine! Christine!" Bitter tears scorched the boy's eyelids as he saw scattered over the furniture the clothes which his beautiful bride was to have worn at the hour of their flight. Raoul, his throat filled with sobs, oaths and insults, fumbled awkwardly at the great mirror that had opened one night before his eyes to let Christine pass to the murky dwelling below. He pushed, pressed, groped about, but the glass apparently obeyed no one but Eric. Suddenly, Raoul remembered something about a gate opening to the Rue Scribe, an underground passage running straight to the Rue Scribe from the lake. Outside, in the street, he passed his trembling hands over the huge stones, felt for outlets, met with iron bars. Were those they? Or these? Or could it be that air-hole? He listened. All was silence. Raoul darted away, roaring with anger, and found himself once more in the light of the stage. He saw a group of men and asked, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen. Could you tell me where Christine Daae is?" Somebody laughed. "This is the gentleman to whom you should put your question, monsieur. Let me introduce Monsieur Mifroid, the commissaire of police." "Ah, Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny, delighted to meet you, monsieur," said the commissaire. "Would you mind coming with me?" He led the way to the manager's door, and they all rushed into the office on the commissaire's heels. Raoul was the last to enter. As he was about to follow the rest into the room, a hand was laid on his shoulder, and he heard these words spoken in his ear. "Eric's secrets concern no one but himself." He turned around with a stifled exclamation. It was the Persian. The stranger kept up the gesture that recommended discretion, and then, at the moment when the astonished Viscount was about to ask the reason of his mysterious intervention, bowed and disappeared. The first words of the commissaire of police, entering the manager's office, were to ask after the missing prima donna. "Is Christine Daae here?" Monsieur Richard replied with surprise. "No. Why do you ask if Christine Daae is here, monsieur le commissaire?" "Because she has to be found," declared the commissaire of the police solemnly. "What do you mean, she has to be found? Has she disappeared?" "In the middle of the performance." Monsieur Richard took his head in his hands and muttered, "Oh, it's enough to make a man send in his resignation." He pulled a few hairs out of his moustache without even knowing what he was doing. Monsieur Mifroid continued, "Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny maintains that Christine Daae was carried off by an angel of the opera, no doubt." Raoul spoke. "The angel is called Eric. He lives in the opera. He is the angel of music." Monsieur Mifroid asked the managers, "Have you an angel of music on the premises, gentlemen?" Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin shook their heads without even speaking. "Oh," said Raoul, "those gentlemen have heard of the opera ghost. Well, I am in the position to state that the opera ghost and the angel of music are one and the same person." "Gentlemen, it appears that you know the opera ghost," sighed Monsieur Mifroid. Monsieur Richard rose, with the remaining hairs of his moustache in his hand, and said, "No, Monsieur Commissaire, no, we do not know him, but we wish that we did, for this very evening he had robbed us of 20,000 francs. As for Mifroid, he looked at the managers and at Raoul by turns, and wondered whether he had strayed into a lunatic asylum. He passed his hand through his hair. At last he addressed Raoul. "Monsieur, we have talked enough about the ghost. We will now talk about yourself a little, if you have no objection. You were to carry off Mademoiselle Christine Daae tonight?" "Yes, Monsieur le Commissaire," replied Raoul. He continued his questioning. "The carriage that brought you was also going to take you both away?" "That is true, Monsieur le Commissaire." "Did you know that there were 3 other carriages there in addition to yours? And did you know that the carriage of your brother, Monsieur le Comte de Chagny, is gone?" Raoul was baffled. "But this is nothing to say to—" "I beg your pardon? Was not Monsieur le Comte opposed to your marriage with Mademoiselle Daae? And that was why you were carrying Christine Daae out of your brother's reach? Well, Monsieur Chagny, allow me to inform you that your brother has been smarter than you. It is he who has carried off Christine Daae." "No, it's impossible," moaned Raoul, pressing his hand to his heart. Are you sure?" Then he cried, "Oh, I shall catch them!" And he rushed out of the office. At the entrance to the very first corridor, a tall figure blocked Raoul's way. "Where are you going so fast, Monsieur de Chagny?" asked a voice. Raoul impatiently raised his eyes and recognized the astrakhan cap of an hour ago. He stopped. "It's you!" he cried in a feverish voice. "You, who know Eric's secrets and don't want me to speak of them. Who are you?" "You know who I am. I am the Persian." The man with the ebony skin, the eyes of jade, and the astrakhan cap bent over Raoul. "I hope, Monsieur de Chagny," he said, "that you have not betrayed Eric's secret. Where are you going so fast?" "To Christine Daae's assistance," replied Raoul. "Then, sir, stay here, for Christine Daae is here." "With Eric?" "With Eric." "How do you know?" "I was at the performance, and no one in the world but Eric could contrive an abduction like that. Oh," he said with a deep sigh, "I recognized the monster's touch." "Sir," said Raoul, I do not know what your intentions are, but can you do anything to help me? I mean to help Christine Daae?" "I think so, Monsieur de Chagny, and that is why I spoke to you." "What can you do?" "Try to take you to her and to him." "Do you think he's near us?" asked Raoul excitedly. "It is quite possible, sir, if he is not at this moment with his victim in the house on the lake." "Ah, so you know the house too?" "If he is not there, he may be here, in this wall, in this floor, in this ceiling. Come." Raoul followed the Persian. After going up and down several staircases which Raoul had never seen before, the 2 men found themselves in front of a door which the Persian opened with a master key. "Sir," said the Persian, "your tall hat will be in your way. You would do well to leave it in the dressing-room." "What dressing-room?" asked Raoul. "Christine Daae's." The Persian, letting Raoul through the door which he had just opened, showed him the actress's room opposite. He pushed the young man into Christine's dressing-room. There was a sound of someone stirring in the lumber-room, and a few seconds later a finger tapped the door. "Come in," said the Persian. A man entered, also wearing an astrakhan cap and dressed in a long overcoat. He bowed and took a richly carved case from under his coat, put it on the dressing-table, bowed once again, and went to the door. "Let no one see you go out." The servant glanced down the passage and swiftly disappeared. The Persian opened the case. It contained a pair of long pistols. Handing one of the pistols to Raoul, he said, "We shall be 2 to 1, but you must be prepared for everything. for we shall be fighting the most terrible adversary that you can imagine. But you love Christine Daae, do you not?" "I worship the ground she stands on. But you, sir, who do not love her, tell me why I find you ready to risk your life for her. You must certainly hate Eric." "No, sir," said the Persian sadly. "I do not hate him. If I hated him, he would long ago have ceased doing harm." "Has he done you harm?" "I have forgiven him the harm which he has done to me." He fetched a stool and set it against the wall, facing the great mirror that filled the whole of the wall opposite. Then he climbed on the stool, and with his nose to the wallpaper seemed to be looking for something. "Ah," he said, after a long search, "I have it." Then, bearing against the mirror, and after a short silence, he said, "It takes some time to release the counterbalance when you press on the spring from the inside of the room." "But it's not turning," said Raoul impatiently. "Oh, wait. The mechanism has obviously become rusty, or else the spring isn't working. Unless it is something else," added the Persian anxiously. "He may simply have cut the cord of the counterbalance and blocked the whole apparatus. After all, he commands the walls, the doors, and the trapdoors. In my country he is known by a name which means the trapdoor lover." Raoul was perplexed. "But why do these walls obey him alone? He did not build them." "Yes, sir. That is just what he did." The Persian made a sign to him to be silent and pointed to the glass. There was a sort of shivering reflection. Their image was troubled as in a rippling sheet of water, and then all became stationary again. "Look out!" declared the Persian, "and be ready to fire!" Suddenly the mirror turned, in a blinding daze of crosslights, carried Raoul and the Persian with it, and hurled them from the full light into the deepest darkness. The wall, behind them, having completed the circle which it described upon itself, closed again, and the two men stood motionless for a moment, holding their breath. At last, the Persian decided to make a movement. Raoul heard him slip to his knees and feel for something in the dark with his groping hands. Suddenly, the darkness was made visible by a small, dark lantern, and Raoul instinctively stepped backward as though to escape the scrutiny of a secret enemy. He soon perceived, however, that the light belonged to the Persian, whose movements he was closely observing. Raoul heard a faint click, and saw a very pale, luminous square in the floor of the passage. It was as though a window had opened on the opera cellars, which were still lit. Raoul heard the Persian whisper, "Follow me, and do all that I do." He saw the Persian hang by his hands from the rim of the opening, with his pistol between his teeth, and slide into the cellar below. Raoul went on his knees also, and hung from the trap with both hands. "Let go," said a voice. Then he dropped into the arms of the Persian, who told him to lie down flat, closed the trapdoor above him, and crouched down beside him. Raoul tried to ask a question, but the Persian's hand was on his mouth, and he heard a voice which he recognized as that of the commissaire of police. Raoul and the Persian were completely hidden behind a wooden partition. The faint light was just enough to enable Raoul to distinguish the shape of things around him. He could not restrain a dull cry. There were 3 corpses there. The commissaire's voice was now heard more distinctly. He was asking for information about the system of lighting. The stage manager showed him a door that opened the box reserved for the chief lighting man. "I say," said the commissaire, I can't open this door. Is it always so difficult?" The stage manager forced it open with his shoulder. He saw that at the same time he was pushing a human body, and he could not keep back an exclamation, for he recognized the body at once. "The lighting man! Poor devil! He is dead." Monsieur Commissaire Miffroy, whom nothing surprised, was stooping over the big body and said, No, he's dead drunk, which is not quite the same thing." "It's the first time, if so," said the stage manager. "Then someone has given him a narcotic. That is quite possible. Look!" By the light of a little red lantern at the foot of the stairs, they saw 2 other bodies. The stage manager recognized the lighting man's assistants. Miffroy went down and listened to their breathing. "They're sound asleep," he said. A curious business. The stage manager, holding his chin in the hollow of his right hand, which is the attitude of profound thought, said, "It is not the first time that Mauclair has fallen asleep in the theatre. I remember finding him not so very long ago. It was the night when Carlotta gave a famous coac." Monsieur Mifroid fixed the stage manager with a contemplative stare. Raoul and the Persian, themselves unobserved, watched the removal of the three bodies by a number of scene-shifters, who were followed by the commissaire and all the people with him. When they were alone, the Persian made a sign to Raoul to stand up. Raoul did so, but as he did not lift his hand in front of his eyes, ready to fire, the Persian told him to resume that attitude and to continue it, whatever happened. "But it tires the hand unnecessarily," whispered Raoul. "Then shift your pistol to the other hand," said the Persian. "But I can't shoot with my left hand." Thereupon the Persian made this queer reply. "It's not a question of shooting with the right hand or the left. It's a question of holding one of your hands as though you were going to pull the trigger of a pistol itself. When all is said, you can put the pistol in your pocket. Let this be clearly understood, or I will answer for nothing. It is a matter of life and death. Now, silence, and follow me." Raoul followed the Persian, and wondered what he would have done without his companion in that extraordinary labyrinth of the inside of the opera. The Persian kept on turning to Raoul to see if he was holding his arm properly. "Your hand up, sir. Ready to fire. Bend your arm. More. That's it. Hand at the level of your eye, as though you were fighting a duel and waiting for the word to fire." Suddenly he stopped Raoul with a gesture. Something moved in the darkness before them. "Flat on your stomach," whispered the Persian. The two men lay flat on the floor. They were only just in time. A shade, carrying no light, just a shade in the shade, passed. "It's not he," whispered Raoul. "He? If he does not come behind us, we shall always see his yellow eyes. That is more or less our safeguard tonight. And don't forget, we are dead men if you do not keep your hands as if about to fire at the level of our eyes, in front." The Persian had hardly finished speaking when a fantastic face came into sight, a whole fiery face, not only two yellow eyes. A head of fire came toward them at man's height, but with no body attached to it. "Oh," said the Persian between his teeth, "I have never seen this before. It is not he, but he may have sent it. Take care. Your hand at the level of your eyes. I know most of his tricks, but not this one. Hand at the level of your eyes." They fled down the long passage that opened before them. Raoul turned his head and saw again the head of fire. It had followed them. At the same time, they began to perceive a certain noise of which they could not guess the nature. It was a noise as though thousands of nails had been scraped against a blackboard, the perfectly unendurable noise that is sometimes made by a little stone inside the chalk that grates on the blackboard. They continued to retreat, but the fiery face came on, gaining on them. They could see its features clearly now. The eyes were round and staring, the nose a little crooked and the mouth large, with a hanging lower lip, very like the eyes, nose, and lip of the moon, when the moon is quite red, bright red. The Persian and Raoul could retreat no farther and flatten themselves against the wall, not knowing what was going to happen because of that incomprehensible head of fire, and especially now because of the more intense, swarming, living, numerous sound. But the sound was certainly made up of hundreds of little sounds that moved in the darkness under the fiery face. The two companions, flat against the wall, felt their hair stand on end with horror, for they now knew what the thousand noises meant. They came in a troop, hustled along in the shadow by innumerable little hurried waves, and the little waves passed between their legs, climbing up their legs irresistibly. Raoul and the Persian could no longer restrain their cries of horror, dismay, and pain, nor could they continue to hold their hands at the level of their eyes. Their hands went down to their legs to push back the waves, which were full of little legs and nails and claws and teeth. They were ready to faint. But the head of fire turned round in answer to their cries and spoke to them. "Don't move! Don't move! Whatever you do, don't come after me! I am the rat-catcher! Let me pass with my rats!" The head of fire disappeared, vanished into the darkness. Raoul and the Persian breathed again. though still trembling. "I ought to have remembered that Eric talked to me about the rat-catcher," said the Persian. "But he never told me that he looked like that."
"Are we very far from the lake, sir?" asked Raoul. "When shall we get there? Oh, take me to the lake! Oh, take me to the lake!"
"Baby," said the Persian, "we shall never enter the house on the lake by the lake."
"But then, what are we here for?" asked Raoul.
The Persian tried to calm the young man. "We have only one means of saving Christine Daae, believe me, which is to enter the house unperceived by the monster." "How can one enter the house on the lake without crossing the lake?" "From the third cellar. I will tell you the exact place, sir. It is between a set piece and a discarded scene from Roi de Lahore, exactly at the spot where Joseph Bouquet died. Come, sir, take courage and follow me." They gradually arrived beneath the huge cellars below the stage. "Look out," the Persian said. "Keep your hand up." Then he motioned to Raoul to go on his knees, and in this way, crawling on both knees and one hand, for the other hand was held in the position indicated, they reached the end wall. Against this wall stood a large discarded scene from the Roi de Lahore. Close to this scene was a set piece. The Persian, still kneeling, stopped and listened. He seemed to hesitate. At last he tossed his head and slipped between the set piece and the scene from the Roi de Lahore, with Raoul close on his heels. Raoul saw him bear heavily upon the wall, just as he had pressed against the wall in Christine's dressing room. Then a stone gave way, leaving a hole in the wall. The hole was very narrow. The Persian stopped almost at once. "We shall have to drop a few yards without making a noise. Take off your boots. I'm going to hang by my hands from the edge of the stone and let myself drop into the house. You must do exactly the same. Do not be afraid. I will catch you in my arms." Raoul soon heard a dull sound, evidently produced by the fall of the Persian, and then dropped down himself. They stood motionless, listening. The Persian stooped and picked up something, a sort of cord, which he examined for a second and flung away with horror. "The Punjab lasso," he muttered. The Persian shivered, and suddenly, seized with fresh anxiety, he moved the little red disc of his lantern over the walls. "This wall is a looking-glass," said the Persian, in a tone of deep emotion. Passing the hand that held the pistol over his moist forehead, he added, "We have dropped into the torture chamber." As they waited in the mirrored room with a horrified solitude for a sign of life, hopefully Christine's, the Persian told Raoul how he knew of the torture chamber. "I had often begged the trapdoor lover, as we used to call Eric in my country, to open the mysterious doors of his house on the lake to me. He always refused. One day, when I thought myself alone, I stepped into the boat and rowed toward the part of the wall through which I had seen Eric disappear. I had no sooner put off from the bank than the silence amid which I floated on the water was disturbed by a sort of whispered singing that hovered all around me. It was half breath, half music, and it rose softly from the waters of the lake. I leaned out of my little boat over the water, for there was no doubt in my mind that the singing came from the water itself. You see, I come from a country where we are too fond of fantastic things not to know them through and through. I had no doubt but that I was face to face with some new invention of Eric's. I leaned out until I almost overturned the boat. Suddenly, two monstrous arms seized me by the neck, dragging me down to the depths with irresistible force. I should certainly have been lost if I had not had time to give a cry by which Eric knew me. For it was he, and instead of drowning me, as was certainly his first intention, he swam with me and laid me gently on the bank. "How imprudent you are," he said, dripping with water. "Why try to enter my house? I never invited you. Did you save my life only to make it unbearable to me?" He spoke, but I had now no other wish than to know what I already called the trick of the siren. He satisfied my curiosity, for Eric, who is a real monster, is also, in certain respects, a regular child, vain and self-conceited, and there is nothing he loves so much after astonishing people as to prove all the really miraculous ingenuity of his mind. He laughed and showed me a long reed. "It's the silliest trick you ever saw," he said, "but it's very useful for breathing and singing in the water." "It's a trick that nearly killed me," I said, "and it may have been fatal to others. You know what you promised me, Eric. No more murders. Have I really committed murders? He asked, putting on his most amiable air. My dear Daroga, which means chief of police in Persian, take my advice and never get into my boat again. Whatever you do, don't try to enter my house. From that day, I gave up all thought of penetrating into his house by the lake. That entrance was obviously too well guarded, but I felt that there must be another entrance. Eric announced to me very solemnly that he had changed and that he had become the most virtuous of men since he was loved for himself. A sentence that at first perplexed me most terribly. I could not help shuddering when I thought of the monster. His horrible, unparalleled, and repulsive ugliness put him without the pale of humanity, and it often seemed to me that, for this reason, he no longer believed that he had any duty towards the human race. When he went out in the streets or ventured to show himself in public, he wore a pasteboard nose with a moustache attached to it instead of his own horrible hole of a nose. This did not quite take away his corpse-like air, but it made him almost, I say, almost endurable to look at. A few days later, much to my amazement, I learnt by my own eyes and ears that Eric had Christine Daae at the house on the lake. I felt sure that the poor girl was a prisoner there. For 24 hours I lay in wait on the other side of the lake for the monster to appear. Then I heard a slight splashing in the dark. I saw the two yellow eyes shining like candles, and soon the boat touched the shore. Eric jumped out and walked up to me. "You've been here for 24 hours, he said, "and you're annoying me. You think you are following me, you great booby, whereas it is I who am following you. I know all that you know about me here. I spared you yesterday, but don't let me catch you there again. Upon my word, you don't seem able to take a hint. I tell you that with your recklessness, for you have already been twice arrested by the shade in the felt hat, who did not know what you were doing in the cellars and took you to the manager's. Oh, I know all about that. Well, I'll tell you that with your recklessness, they will end by wondering what you are after here. And they will end by knowing that you are after Eric, and then they will discover the house on the lake. And if they do, it will be a bad lookout for you, old chap. A bad lookout." He puffed and blew like a walrus. "If Eric's secrets cease to be Eric's secrets, it will be a bad lookout for a goodly number of the human race. That's all I have to tell you. And unless you are a great booby, it ought to be enough for you, except that you don't know how to take a hint." He sat down on the stern of his boat and was kicking his heels against the planks, waiting to hear what I had to answer. I simply said, "It's not Eric that I am after here." "Who then?" he demanded. "You know as well as I do. It's Christine Daae." He retorted, "I have every right to see her in my own house. I am loved for my own sake." "That's not true," I said. "You have carried her off and are keeping her locked up." "Listen," he said. "Will you promise never to meddle with my affairs again if I prove to you that I am loved for my own sake?" "Yes, I promise you," I replied. "Well then, it's quite simple. Christine Daae shall leave this as she pleases and come back again." "Oh, I doubt if she will come back. It is your duty to let her go." "My duty, you great booby? It is my wish, for she loves me. All this will end in marriage. A marriage at the Madeleine, you great booby." "Look here," I said. "I shall believe you if I see Christine Daae come out of the house on the lake and go back to it of her own accord." To my intense astonishment, things happened as he announced. Christine Daae left the house on the lake and returned to it several times without apparently being forced to do so. I continued to be greatly interested in the relations between Eric and Christine Daae because of the terrible thought that Eric was capable of anything if he once discovered that he was not loved for his own sake as he imagined. I was prepared to do anything, to kill the monster if necessary, and explain to the police afterward. But Eric did not show himself. One day, tired of waiting for an opportunity, I moved a stone in the third cellar, which was the only entrance to his house other than by way of the lake. I had once heard an astounding music. The monster was working at his Don Juan triumphant, with every door in his house wide open. I knew that this was the work of his life. I was careful not to stir, and remained prudently in my dark hole. He stopped playing for a moment, and began walking about his place like a madman, and he said aloud, at the top of his voice, "It must be finished first, quite finished." I closed the stone very softly. The abduction of Christine Daae tonight, which naturally surprised everybody, found me prepared. I was quite certain that she had been juggled away by Eric, that prince of conjurers. I knew this was the moment to enter his house through the third cellar, and I resolved to take you with me. I sent my servant for my pistols, and gave one to you, and advised you to hold it, ready to fire. I didn't have time to explain anything. My great fear was that Eric was already somewhere near us, preparing the Punjab lasso. No one knows better than he how to throw the Punjab lasso, for he is the king of stranglers, even as he is the prince of conjurers. He had lived in India and acquired an incredible skill in the art of strangulation. He would make them lock him into a courtyard, to which they brought a warrior, usually a man condemned to death armed with a long pike and broadsword. Eric had only his lasso, and it was always just when the warrior thought that he was going to fell Eric with a tremendous blow that we heard the lasso whistle through the air. With a turn of the wrist, Eric tightened the noose around his adversary's neck. I have mentioned this only to explain why I was bound to protect you against the ever-threatening danger of death by strangling. My pistol served no purpose, for Eric is not likely to show himself, but Eric could always strangle us. I simply told you to keep your hand at the level of your eyes, with the arm bent, as though waiting for the command to fire. With a victim in this attitude, it is impossible even for the most expert strangler to throw the lasso with advantage. I also know Eric too well to feel comfortable on jumping into his house. I know what he made of a certain palace at Mazenderan. From being the most honest building conceivable, he soon turned it into a house of the very devil. With his trapdoors, the monster was responsible for endless tragedies of all kinds. He hit upon astonishing inventions. Of these, the most curious, horrible, and dangerous was the so-called torture chamber. You can understand my alarm, therefore, when I saw that the room which we had dropped into is an exact copy of the torture chamber at Mazenderan. Now, at our feet, I find the Punjab lasso which I had been dreading all evening. They were in the middle of a six-cornered room, the sides of which were covered with mirrors from top to bottom. Suddenly they heard a noise on their left. It sounded at first like a door opening and shutting in the next room, and then there was a dull moan, and they distinctly heard these words: "You must make your choice, the wedding mass or the requiem mass." The Persian recognized the voice of the monster. He was persuaded, however, that the monster was unaware of their presence in his house, for otherwise he would have certainly managed not to let them hear him. He was also certain that if Eric had known of their presence, the tortures would have begun at once. The Persian dreaded nothing so much as the impulsiveness of the Vicomte de Chagny, who wanted to rush through the walls to Christine Daae, whose moans they continued to hear at intervals. Eric's voice resumed. "I can't go on living like this, like a mole in a burrow. Don Juan Triumphant is finished, and now I want to live like everybody else. I want to have a wife like everybody else and to take her out on Sundays. I have invented a mask that makes me look like anybody. People will not even turn round in the streets. You will be the happiest of women. Love me, and you shall see. All I wanted was to be loved for myself. If you loved me, I should be as gentle as a lamb. You could do anything with me that you pleased." Christine seemed to be standing dumb with horror, without the strength to cry out, while the monster was on his knees before her. A silence. Each silence gave Raoul and the Persian fresh hope. They said to themselves, "Perhaps he has left Christine behind the wall," as they were unable to leave the torture chamber unless Christine opened the door to them, for they did not even know where the door might be. Suddenly, the silence in the next room was disturbed by the ringing of an electric bell and Eric's voice of thunder. "Somebody ringing! I'm going to tell the siren to open the door!" Steps moved away. A door closed. Christine was alone behind the wall. Raoul was already calling to her, "Christine! Christine!" At last, A faint voice reached them.
"I am dreaming," it said. "Christine, it's not a dream. It is I, Raoul. We're here to save you, but be prudent. When you hear the monster, warn us."
Then Christine gave way to fear. She trembled lest Eric should discover where Raoul was hidden. She told him in a few hurried words that Eric had gone quite mad with love, and that he decided to kill everybody and himself with everybody if she did not consent to become his wife. He had given her till 11 o'clock the next evening for reflection.
"Can you tell us where Eric is?" the Persian asked.
She replied that he must have left the house.
"Could you make sure?"
"No, I'm fastened. I cannot stir a limb." When they heard this, they both gave a yell of fury. Their safety, the safety of all three of them, depended on the girl's liberty of movement. "But where are you?" asked Christine. Then, with horror in her voice, she asked, "Are you in the torture chamber?" "Yes," said Raoul. "We cannot see the door." "Mademoiselle," the Persian said, "it is absolutely necessary that you should open that door to us."
"I know where the key is," she said, "but I'm fastened so tight."
She gave a sob as she continued, It's in the next room with another little bronze key. They're both in a little leather bag, which he calls the bag of life and death." The Persian whispered,
"Why has he fastened you, mademoiselle?"
"I tried to commit suicide. The monster went out last night, and when he returned he found me with my face covered with blood. I had tried to kill myself by striking my forehead against the walls." "Christine!" groaned Raoul, and he began to sob. Then Christine said,
"Hush! I hear something in the wall on the lake. It is he."
Heavy steps sounded slowly behind the wall. Next came a tremendous sigh, followed by a cry of horror from Christine, and then they heard Eric's voice. "I beg your pardon for letting you see a face like this. What a state I am in, am I not? Why did you cry out, Christine?"
"Because I am in pain, Eric. Unloose my bonds."
"You will try to kill yourself again. But after all, as we are to die together, and I am just as eager as you, I will release you. You have only one word to say, no, and it will at once be over with everybody. You're looking at me because I am all wet. You know, the man who rang at the siren's door just now. Go and look if he's ringing at the bottom of the lake. You're free now. Oh, my poor Christine, look at your wrists. Tell me, have I hurt them? That alone deserves death. Talking of death, I must sing his requiem." Eric sang like the god of thunder. Suddenly, the organ and the voice ceased so suddenly that Raoul sprang back on the other side of the wall with emotion. The voice, changed and transformed, distinctly grated out these metallic syllables. "What have you done with my bag?" "So it was to take my bag that you asked me to release you," bellowed the monster. Raoul and the Persian heard the hurried steps of Christine running. "Give me back my bag, will you? Don't you know that it is the bag of life and death?"
"Listen to me, Eric," sighed the girl. "As it is settled that we are to live together, I want to look at this room which I have never seen, which you've always kept from me. It's a woman's curiosity," she said, in a tone which she tried to render playful. But the trick was too childish for Eric to be taken in by it. He chuckled, while Christine gave a cry of pain as he recovered the bag from her. At that moment, Raoul could not help uttering an exclamation of impotent rage. "Why, what's that?" said the monster. "Did you hear, Christine?" No, replied the poor girl. I heard nothing."
"You're lying. There was a cry. There is someone in the torture chamber."
"No, there is no one there, Eric."
"Well, it won't take long to find out, Christine. We need not open the door to see what is happening in the torture chamber. Would you like to see? Look here. You will see the invisible window light up at the top near the ceiling." Then, that which the Persian feared above all things began automatically. They were suddenly flooded with light. "I told you there was someone," said the monster. "You shall go up the folding steps. That is what they are there for. You have often asked me to tell you, and now you know. They are there to give a peep into the torture chamber. Go and peep through the little window. Tell me what he looks like. Up with you! No, 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 I will go up myself, dear."
"No," cried Christine. "No, I'll go up. Let me go." She went up the stairs and said, "There is no one there, dear. No one."
Eric answered, "What's the matter, Christine? You're not going to faint, are you, as there is no one there? By the way, how do you like the landscape?"
"Oh, very much," she replied. "It's like the Musée Grévin. But I say, Eric, there are no torches in there. What a fright you gave me. It's very handsome. You're a great artist, Eric. Why did you call that room the torture chamber?"
"Oh, it's very simple. First of all, what do you see?"
"I see a forest," said Christine.
"You see," said the monster, "it's all a joke. I never express myself like other people, but I'm very tired of it. I'm sick and tired of having a forest and a torture chamber in my house and of living like a mountebank in a house with a false bottom. I want to have a nice, quiet apartment with ordinary doors and windows and a wife inside it like everybody else. Oh, but you would have lots of fun with me. For instance, I am the greatest ventriloquist that ever lived. I am the first ventriloquist in the world." The wretch was only trying to divert the child's attention from the torture chamber, but it was a stupid scheme, for Christine thought of nothing but Raoul. She repeatedly besought Eric in the gentlest tones which he could assume, "Put out the light in the little window," for she saw that this light must mean something terrible. The other had already begun to play the ventriloquist. "Here, I raise my mask a little. You see my lips? Such lips as I have. They're not moving. And yet you hear my voice. In the table, in that little box on the mantelpiece, and now, crack! It is in Carlotta's throat. What does it say? It says, it's I, Mr. Toad, it's I singing. Quack!"
"Eric, Eric," said Christine, "you tire me with your voice. Don't go on, Eric. Isn't it very hot in here?"
"Oh, yes," replied Eric's voice. "The heat is unendurable."
"But what does this mean? The wall is really getting quite hot. The wall is burning."
"I tell you, Christine dear, it is because of the forest next door. Didn't you see that it was an African forest?" The monster laughed loudly and hideously. Then there was the sound of a body falling on the floor and being dragged along, and a door slammed, and then nothing. Nothing more around Raoul and the Persian, save the scorching silence of the south in the heart of a tropical forest. The room in which Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny and the Persian were imprisoned was a palace of illusion. In the hexagonal room, lined with mirrors, a decorative object, for instance, such as a column, could be placed in one of the corners, and it would immediately produce a hall of 1,000 columns. Eric altered his invention into a torture chamber. For the architectural motif placed in one corner, he substituted an iron tree. This tree, with its painted leaves, was absolutely true to life. There was no other furniture, and the ceiling was capable of being lit up with an ingenious system of electric heating. All these details produced the supernatural illusion of an equatorial forest blazing under the tropical sun. There was only one possible outlet, the opening into the Louis-Philippe room in which Eric and Christine Daae were. But though this outlet looked like an ordinary door on Christine's side, it was absolutely invisible to Raoul and the Persian. Raoul was already walking about like a madman, uttering incoherent cries. The shock of the magic forest and the scorching heat was beginning to make the perspiration stream down his temples. He shouted Christine's name, brandished his pistol, and knocked his forehead against the glass in his endeavours to run down the glades of the elusive forest. The Persian did his best to induce the poor Viscount to listen to reason. "We are in a room, a little room. That is what you must keep saying to yourself. We shall leave the room as soon as we have found the door." He promised him that he would discover the trick of the door in less than an hour's time. He then tackled the glass panel and began to finger it in every direction, hunting for the weak point on which to press in order to turn the door in accordance with Eric's system of pivots. This weak point might be a mere speck on the glass, no larger than a pea, under which the spring lay hidden. He had been working like this for half an hour, and had finished 3 panels when, as ill luck would have it, he turned round on hearing a muttered exclamation from Raoul. "I am stifling," Raoul said. "All those mirrors are sending out an infernal heat. Do you think you will find that spring soon? If you're much longer about it, we shall be roasted alive." After giving him a word of encouragement, the Persian returned to his panel, but he had made the mistake of taking a few steps while speaking, and in the tangle of the elusive forest he was no longer able to find his panel for certain. He had to begin all over again, at random, feeling, fumbling, groping. Both Raoul and the Persian had repeatedly taken off their coats and put them on again, finding at one time that they made them feel still hotter, and at another that they protected them against the heat. "Oh, how thirsty I am!" Raoul cried in delirious accents. Suddenly, they heard a lion roaring a few yards away. The roaring continued, louder and louder. Raoul fired his pistol, but did not hit the lion. Instead, he smashed a mirror. Then they suddenly found themselves on the edge of a desert, an immense desert of sand, stone, and rocks. Tired out, the Persian flung himself down beside Raoul, for he had had enough of looking for springs which he could not find. What was to become of them in the midst of that awful solitude? They were beginning literally to die of heat, hunger, and thirst. At last, Raoul raised himself on his elbow and pointed to a spot on the horizon. He had discovered an oasis. The Persian did his utmost to keep his head and not to hope for water, because he knew that if a man hoped for water, and if, after hoping for water, he struck against the mirror, then there was only one thing for him to do, to hang himself on the iron tree. The Persian cried to Raoul, "It's the mirage! Don't believe in the water! It's another trick of the mirrors!" Raoul dragged himself along, saying, "Water! Water!" His mouth was open, as though he were drinking. Then, the most pitiless torture of all, they heard the rain, and it was not raining. Their eyes and ears were full of water, but their tongues were hard and dry as horn. When they reached the mirror, Raoul licked it. It was burning hot. He rolled on the floor with a hoarse cry of despair. Raoul put the one pistol that was still loaded to his temple, and the Persian stared at the Punjab lasso at the foot of the iron tree. As he stared at the Punjab lasso, the Persian saw a thing that made him start so violently that Raoul delayed his attempt at suicide. He dragged himself on his knees towards what he had seen. The Persian had discovered, near the Punjab lasso, in a groove in the floor, a black-headed nail. At last he had discovered the spring. The nail yielded to his pressure, and they saw, not a door open in the wall, but a cellar flap released in the floor. Cool air came up to them from the black hole below. They stooped over that square of darkness as though over a limpid well. With their chins in the cool shade, they drank it in. What could there be in that cellar which opened before them? Water? Water to drink? The Persian thrust his arm into the darkness and came upon a stone. Then another stone, a staircase, a dark staircase leading into the cellar. Raoul wanted to fling himself down the hole, but the Persian, fearing a new trick of the monster's, stopped him and instead turned on his dark lantern and went down first. They soon reached the bottom. Their eyes were beginning to accustom themselves to the dark, to distinguish shapes around them, circular shapes on which he turned the light of his lantern. Barrels. They were in Eric's cellar. It was here that he must keep his wine and perhaps his drinking water. The Persian knew that Eric was a great lover of good wine. Ah, there was plenty to drink here. Raoul patted the round shapes and kept on saying, "Barrels, barrels, what a lot of barrels!" Then, after half lifting one of them to make sure it was full, they went on their knees and, with the blade of a small knife which the Persian carried, they prepared to stave in the bunghole. They burst the bung, and Raoul cried out, "What's this? This isn't water!" What they saw in Raoul's hands was gunpowder. They now knew what the monster meant to convey when he said to Christine, "If your answer is no, everybody will be dead and buried." The monster had given her until 11 o'clock in the evening. He had chosen his time well. There would be many people, many members of the human race up there in the resplendent theatre. What could Christine say but no? She did not know that on her acceptance or refusal depended the awful fate of many members of the human race. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. Suddenly, a terrible thought came into the Persian's mind. He spoke his fears aloud. What is the time? After all, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening might be now, might be this very moment. We seem to have been imprisoned in this hell for days and days, for years, since the beginning of the world. Raoul and the Persian began to yell like madmen. Fear spurred them on. They rushed up the treads of the staircase, stumbling as they went, anything to escape the dark, to return to the mortal light of the room of mirrors. They found the trapdoor still open, but it was now as dark in the room of mirrors as in the cellar which they had left. What was the time? They called out, Raoul to Christine and the Persian to Eric. If only they could see the face of a watch. The Persian's had stopped, but Raoul's was still going. He broke the glass of his watch and felt the two hands. Judging by the space between the hands, he thought it might be just 11 o'clock. But perhaps it was not the 11 o'clock of which they stood in dread. Perhaps they still had 12 hours before them. Suddenly the Persian exclaimed, "Hush!" They seemed to hear footsteps in the next room. Someone tapped against the wall. Christine Daae's voice said, "Raoul! Raoul!" They were now all talking at once on either side of the wall. Christine sobbed. The monster had been terrible. He had done nothing but rave, waiting for her to give him the yes which she refused. At last, after hours and hours of that hell, he had that moment gone out, leaving her alone to reflect for the last time. "What time is it, Christine?" asked the Persian anxiously. "It is 11 o'clock, all but 5 minutes till. The 11 o'clock that is to decide life or death. He told me so just before he went. He's quite mad. He tore off his mask, and his yellow eyes shot flames. He said, 'Here is the little bronze key that opens 2 ebony caskets. In one of the caskets you will find a scorpion, in the other a grasshopper. They will say yes or no for you. If you turn the scorpion round, that will mean to me, when I return, that you have said yes. The grasshopper will mean no.' And he laughed like a drunken demon. His last words were, 'Be careful of the grasshopper. It hops, and it hops jolly high.'" The scorpion and the grasshopper were scratching at the Persian's brain. He had sufficient lucidity left to understand that if the grasshopper were turned, it would hop, and with it many members of the human race. There was no doubt but that the grasshopper controlled an electric current intended to blow up the powder magazine. The idea also came to him, for he knew Eric, that the monster had perhaps deceived the girl once more. Perhaps it was the scorpion that would blow everything up. They heard steps approaching. "Here he comes," cried Christine. "Don't touch the scorpion," cried the Persian. Then he raised his voice. "Eric, it is I. Do you know me?" With extraordinary calmness, Eric replied, "So, you are not dead in there? Well, then, see that you keep quiet. Not a word, daroga, or I shall blow everything up. The honor rests with Mademoiselle. If you turn the grasshopper, Mademoiselle, we shall all be blown up. There is enough gunpowder under our feet to blow up a whole quarter of Paris. If you turn the scorpion, Mademoiselle, all that powder will be soaked and drowned, and merrily, merrily we will be married. If, in 2 minutes, Mademoiselle, you have not turned the scorpion, I shall turn the grasshopper, and the grasshopper, I tell you, hops jolly high." "Eric," cried Christine, "do you swear to me, monster, do you swear to me that the scorpion is the one to turn?" "Yes, to hop at our wedding. You won't have the scorpion, then I turn the grasshopper." "Eric, I have turned the scorpion." Oh, the second which Raoul and the Persian passed, waiting to find themselves in fragments amid the roar and the ruins. Suddenly they felt something crack beneath their feet and heard an appalling hiss through the open trapdoor, a hiss like the first sound of a rocket. It came softly at first, then louder, then very loud. But it was not the hiss of fire. It was more like the hiss of water. Then it became a gurgling sound. All their thirst, which vanished when the terror came, now returned with the lapping water. The water rose in the cellar, above the barrels. It rose to their chins, to their mouths, and they drank. They went up the stairs again in the dark, step by step, went up with the water. The water came out of the cellar with them and spread over the floor of the room. "Eric!" shouted the Persian. "Eric! That is water enough for the gunpowder! Turn off the tap! Turn off the scorpion!" Eric did not reply. "Christine!" cried Raoul. "Christine, the water is up to her knees!" They were alone in the dark, with the dark water that seized them, clasped them, and froze them. They lost their foothold, and were spinning round in the water, carried away by an irresistible whirl. Their throats, raised above the whirlpool, roared aloud. Their arms became entangled in an effort of swimming. They choked, they fought in the dark water, then whirled round and began to sink. A last cry, "Eric! Christine!" was uttered by them both before losing consciousness entirely. When he opened his eyes, the Persian found himself lying on a bed. Monsieur de Chagny was on the sofa beside the wardrobe. An angel and a devil were watching over them. The figure of the masked man bent down over the Persian and said, "Are you better, Daroga?" Christine did not say a word. She moved about noiselessly, like a sister of charity who had taken a vow of silence. Eric poured a drop of rum into the Daroga's cup and, pointing to the Viscount, said, "He came to himself long before we knew if you were still alive, Daroga. He is quite well. He's asleep. We must not wake him. You are now saved, both of you. Soon I shall take you up to the surface of the earth to please my wife." Eric mixed the Persian a draught and advised him not to speak to his wife again, nor to anyone, because it might be very dangerous to everybody's health. Eventually the Persian fell asleep, like Raoul, and did not wake until he was in his own room, nursed by his faithful Darius, who told him that on the night before he was found propped against the door of his apartment, where he had been brought by a stranger, who rang the bell before going away. As soon as the Persian recovered his strength and his wits, he sent to Raoul's brother, Count Philippe's house, to inquire after the Viscount's health. The answer was that the young man had not been seen, and that Count Philippe was dead. His body was found on the bank of the Opera Lake, on the Rue Scribe side. The Persian remembered the Requiem Mass which he had heard from behind the wall of the torture chamber, and had no doubt concerning the crime and the criminal. He reconstructed the tragedy. Thinking that his brother had run away with Christine Daae, Philippe had dashed off in pursuit of them. Failing to find them upon the Brussels road, he hurried back to the opera and into Christine's dressing room, where he spied Raoul's hat and the empty pistol case. Then the Count, who no longer entertained any doubt of his brother's madness, in his turn darted into that infernal underground maze beneath the opera and wound up a corpse on the shore of the lake. Some time later, Darius announced the visit of a stranger who refused his name, who would not show his face, and declared simply that he did not intend to leave the place until he had spoken to the Daroga. The Persian at once felt who this singular visitor was, and ordered him to be shown in. The Daroga was right. It was the ghost. It was Eric. He looked extremely weak and leaned against the wall, as though he were afraid of falling. The Persian rose to his feet as Eric entered. "Murderer of Count Philippe, what have you done with his brother and Christine Daae?" Eric staggered, dragged himself to a chair, and heaved a deep sigh. Then, speaking in short phrases and gasping for breath between the words, he said, "Daroga, don't talk to me about Count Philippe. It was an accident. He fell very awkwardly into the lake." "You lie!" shouted the Persian. Eric bowed his head and said, "I have not come here to talk about Count Philippe, but to tell you that I am going to die of love. Daroga, I am dying of love. I tell you, if you knew how beautiful she was when she let me kiss her alive. It was the first time, Daroga, the first time I ever kissed a woman. Yes, alive,
I kissed her alive, and she looked as beautiful as if she had been dead."
The Persian shook Eric by the arm and cried, "Will you tell me if she is alive or dead?" Eric continued,
"I kissed her, just like that, on her forehead, and she did not draw back her forehead from my lips. No, no, she is not dead, and no one shall touch a hair of her head. She is a good, honest girl, and she saved your life, Daroga, at a moment when I would not have given twopence for your Persian skin. Why were you there with that Viscount chap? You would have died as well as he. My word, how she entreated me for her little chap. Christine came to me with her beautiful blue eyes wide open, and swore to me as she hoped to be saved that she consented to be my living wife. Until then, in the depths of her eyes, Daroga, I had always seen my dead wife. It was the first time that I saw my living wife there. Half a minute later, all the water was back in the lake. It was understood that I was to take you both up to the surface of the earth." "What have you done with Raoul?" asked the Persian, interrupting him. "Ah, you see, Daroga, I couldn't carry him up like that at once. He was a hostage. I locked him up comfortably. I chained him up nicely, in the dungeon below the 5th cellar where no one ever comes. Then I came back to Christine."
Eric was overcome by all emotion and began to tremble like a leaf.
"She was waiting for me, erect and alive, a real living bride. She stayed. I even believe, Daroga, that she put out her forehead a little like a living bride, and I kissed her. And she did not die. Oh, how good it is, Daroga, to kiss somebody on the forehead. My mother, Daroga, my poor, unhappy mother, would never let me kiss her. She used to run away and throw me my mask. Nor any other woman, ever. Ah, you can understand. My happiness was so great, I cried, and I fell at her feet crying, and she cried also. Also the angel cried."
Eric sobbed aloud, and the Persian himself could not retain his tears in the presence of that masked man who, with his shoulders shaking and his hands clutched at his chest, was moaning with pain and love by turns.
I felt her tears flow on my forehead. They mingled with my tears in my eyes. I tore off my mask so as not to lose one of her tears, and she did not run away. She did not die. She remained alive, weeping over me, with me. We cried together. I have tasted all the happiness the world can offer."
Eric fell into a chair, choking for breath.
She took my hand. I heard her say, "Poor, unhappy Eric." I had become no more, you know, than a poor dog ready to die for her. I held in my hand a ring, a plain gold ring which I had given her, which she had lost, a wedding ring, you know. I slipped it into her little hand and said, "There, take it for you and him. It shall be my wedding present. I know you love the boy." I made her understand that she could marry the young man when she pleased, because she had cried with me and mingled her tears with mine.
Eric's emotion was so great that he had to tell the Persian not to look at him, for he was choking and must take off his mask.
I went and released the young man. Christine had my ring. I made Christine swear to come back one night when I was dead, crossing the lake from the Rue Scribe side, and bury me in the greatest secrecy with the gold ring which she was to wear until that moment. Then Christine kissed me, for the first time, herself, here on the forehead. Don't look, Daroga. Here, on the forehead, on my forehead, mine. Don't look, Daroga. And they went off together.
The Persian asked him no questions. He was quite reassured as to the fate of Raoul de Chagny and Christine Daae. No one could have doubted the word of the weeping Eric that night. The monster resumed his mask and collected his strength to leave the daroga. Eric then told him that the two young people, as soon as they found themselves free, had resolved to go and look for a priest in some lonely spot where they could hide their happiness. He also told him that he would send him all Christine's papers, together with a few objects belonging to her. Lastly, Eric relied on the Persian, as soon as he received the promised relics and papers, to inform the young couple of his death and to advertise it in the Epoque. That was all. Eric stepped in a cab, and the Persian, who had gone back to the window, heard him say to the driver, "Go to the opera." And the cab drove off into the night. The Persian had seen the poor, unfortunate Eric for the last time. 3 weeks later, the Epoque published this advertisement: "Eric is dead." The end.